All right, guys, we should be live. Those in the chat, just let me know that you can hear me okay, and we will get going. Should be a little bit of delay. Everybody good in the chat? You guys hear everything okay? I'm just going to check, make sure on YouTube. And then we'll bring Ross in. All right, we are live. Good. All right, I am not going to waste any time. I'm going to bring our special guest in today. And there he is from Australia, Ross Coulthart. Ross, thank you so much. We finally get to do it, Ross.
Hey, Joe. How are you, mate?
I'm doing good. So we met, I'm trying to remember, it was sometime before the New York Times article came out. So I don't know if you remember, it was several months before, and we started talking about the article and Wilson Davis. And the way I got introduced to you is, who was it? Rigney, James Rigney said, I have somebody I want you to meet. I'm like, okay, who is it? And he's like, this guy, you're really going to like him. And then we connected, and I was like, thank you so much, James, because you became a great source, a great sounding board for me. And for people who don't know who you are, just talk a little bit about your background and how you got into this subject and reporting.
I'm an investigative journalist and author based in Sydney, Australia. I've worked as a journalist for 36 years. I trained as a lawyer, worked briefly as a lawyer. I have worked in newspapers, television, a bit of radio for all of that time. I've worked for Australia's public broadcaster, the ABC, which is a bit like your PBS. But most recently, I've worked for commercial networks, Channel 9, the 9 network, and Channel 7, which are the two largest commercial networks in Australia. And I've done long-form investigative journalism where I do sort of like 1 hour, 45-minute to 1 hour long investigative features. I've covered terrorism, national security. I've embedded with American soldiers in Iraq and Afghanistan. I've covered wars there and East Timor. Done a lot of defence, national security stuff. I was an investigative reporter. One of the most important stories I've ever broken was a story that assisted me in the work that I'm doing at the moment, which was an investigation into the Five Eyes alliance, the Yakuza agreement, UK-USA agreement, which was signed immediately after World War II between the UK, USA, New Zealand and Canada. And essentially it was a collaborative intelligence sharing agreement. And I broke the story with a guy called Duncan Campbell, a British investigative journalist, about the existence of the Echelon Five Eyes communication surveillance system, which essentially monitors telecommunications surveillance all around the world. The fact of the existence of the system was confirmed for the first time by an interviewee in one of my stories. And I guess that's one of the things that's made me realise the extent of intelligence sharing between Australia and the US and the UK. And it kind of focused my interest in the UAP subject because I had sources in defence here in Australia who were encouraging me to take a look at the UAP phenomenon, especially after the New York Times stories when Leslie Kane, Ralph Blumenthal and Helene Cooper broke their superb December 2017 expose that revealed the existence of the Pentagon UAP program, and also the fact of the USS Nimitz TAC UFO incident, and then the subsequent gimbal and go fast videos. And I basically learned a great deal about the UFO phenomenon by engaging with researchers both here in Australia, Bill Chalker, Keith Basterfield, James Rigney, Paul Dean, really lovely people, top shelf people who've basically been doing a lot of work behind the scenes for many, many years. And they woke me up to the fact that this wasn't some kind of lunatic fringe tinfoil hat crazy predilection. And I also had, when I was working for Four Corners, which is Australia's probably most prestigious public affairs TV show, I was doing a story on the Air Force, and I can't name them, but there were two very senior officers of the Australian Air Force who were engaging with me for the story. And we were sitting in a mess, a bar, one evening after doing some filming with them, and they just got me engaged on the subject of UFOs, UAPs. And it was interesting because in the private forum of an Air Force bar, there was a willingness by military pilots to engage with me about what they were seeing. And it struck me as amazing that there was this cognitive dissonance between what the public are being told, which is essentially, or has essentially been until very recently, that UFOs are bunkum, that they can largely be prosaically explained, and more importantly, that they pose no national security issue. In contradiction to that, I was being told by senior officials in our defence and intelligence services, former retired squadron leaders in our Air Force, commercial pilots, that encounters with UAPs, unidentified aerial phenomena, I prefer that term because it's less loaded, they were very common. And there was a big perceived problem with potential for near misses, and also a clear link between these strange anomalous objects and sensitive military facilities, many of which in Australia are linked into the American strategic nuclear deterrence, places like Pine Gap, which is the base in the middle of central Australia, and also the lesser known Harold E. Holt Naval Communication Station far up in a very remote part of Western Australia called North West Cape, near the town of Exmouth. And these two bases, which I've since discovered are very, very closely linked into America's ICBM and nuclear weapons surveillance all over the planet, and also space object monitoring. They've frequently seen strange anomalous objects going back many decades. And I was also, another thing that really brought me into this area was the history. And I've written history books myself. I'm quite a serious historian. I've written books about the First World War. And I know how to use archives. I use a lot of archival research, both here and overseas. And I was quite struck when I went through the Australian National Archives at the counterfactual history, if you like, the history that was different to what was being told publicly, which was that our Air Force, at least until the 1970s, which was the files that I could see, had right from the 1940s monitored the UFO phenomenon and taken a grave and very serious interest in it. And that indeed, at one stage in the defence science area of our defence department, there was one very senior scientist called Harry Turner, who was heavily involved through the Joint Intelligence Organisation of the Australian Defence Department in pushing for essentially a rapid response unit to respond to UAP sightings, because he'd seen objects during the British nuclear testing at Maralinga in South Australia in the 1950s. And he'd also witnessed strange objects hovering over the ICBM testing that they'd done at the Woomera rocket range as well in the 1960s. So with that all sort of under my belt, I've had a long interest in the phenomenon. I've done a couple of stories about it as a journalist, and it sharpened my awareness of the issue. And I guess also I'm a natural rebel because I was also frequently told by editors and executive producers that UFOs weren't a story, that they were all rubbish and they should be ridiculed. And that taboo, stigma, fascinated me.
And one of the things about your book, and I do want to get into how you started writing letters, but one of the great things about your book, for people, it's great for new people and great for people who, like me, who've been in this for a while, because there's a lot of stuff in your book I'm like, I didn't know that. There's a lot of history I don't know. And one of the things that always comes up when you talk about this subject, people are like, right away, I get this from people new, they go, it's probably black budget. So can you talk about, in the book, you start with the Aboriginal stories, and Blue Bob, I think his nickname was, and also 1930, there was just the Aboriginal cases, and then the two cases from George Jones and Francis Chichester.
Yeah, well, I mean, one of the things I was fascinated by is whatever this phenomenon is, I'd naturally assumed, like a lot of people, that the most plausible explanation must be that this technology, it's a clear technology, these are clearly craft of some kind. I don't buy the line that they're just natural phenomena. They're clearly intelligently controlled craft that are responding in an intelligent way, and they've been around not just in the last few years, they've been around for decades. And one of the things that fascinated me was I had the privilege of going way, way up into the Gulf of Carpentaria in far north Queensland and the Northern Territory, real outback country, red dirt country. And we were with a mining company doing a story about Aboriginal sacred sites, Aboriginal Indigenous people of Australia. And one of the people that was there was a lovely man called Blue Bob, who was black as black, with a beautiful skin, so dark it was almost blue. And he was, treated with reverence by the mining company because he had this almost mystical ability to navigate across the landscape, just using his Dreamtime stories, the Aboriginal oral history in his head. And the chopper pilot said to me, he said, "You just sit in the back and you just watch." He says, "I'm not going to have the GPS on. We're just going to navigate across the landscape, and Blue Bob's going to tell us to go that way, go that way." And that's exactly what he did. And it was fascinating because, contrary to what I expected, every time Blue Bob pointed out a sensitive area or a sacred site that was obviously wanting to be protected under the natural heritage laws, I could see a mining company geologist beside me in the chopper just going, "Oh no," because every single object that Blue Bob pointed out was full of beautiful ore and bauxite, and they'd already gone through and charted all these and found them in their research, and they were trying to find out what the sacred sites were, and they were keen to demonstrate to me as a journalist their sensitivity to making sure they protected sacred sites. But one of the things we did was we landed in a billabong, a beautiful oasis, if you like, and I got the opportunity to Blue Bob, and I asked him about these lights called the Min Min lights, which are these lights that were first spotted by European settlers in, I think, the 1860s, when they started to settle the outback. And they're very well known in Aboriginal mythology. They're lights that appear from nowhere at night time, and they kind of hover around campsites, and they apparently intelligently engage and take an interest in people there. And I asked Blue Bob, I said, these mystical Min Min lights, what's your take on them? And I said, the local radio, I've heard a story recently that they're just truck headlights, the headlights of trucks reflected off moisture in cloud matter or fog. And Blue Bob tipped his head back and laughed and laughed and laughed. He thought that was very funny because he said there weren't many trucks around 3,000 years ago. And he told me that it was part of the Aboriginal oral history. The Min Min lights have been around for many, 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 many thousands of years. And more importantly, the whole Aboriginal mythology of the Wandjina people is way, way up in the Kimberley, Pilbara area of northwest Australia. If you go up there, as I have done, you can see this beautiful rock art and these amazing rock art pictures that are really quite astonishing, with beings, entities that, according to Aboriginal mythology, came down from the sky, and they have this big head with big eyes, and quite alarmingly similar, if you like, to the rendition of greys as described by many experiencers. And it's very much part of Aboriginal mythology that there is a kinship between human beings and the sky people, and the Wandjina beings are part of that mythology. So then, as part of my research, I just started looking at the history of anomalous sightings, and it fascinated me that there was a guy who went on to become the head of Australia's Air Force, a guy called George Jones, who was a young squadron leader in the 1930s, and there was a plethora of sightings over a part of Victoria in southeast of Australia. And huge numbers of residents in the files that I've seen were seeing anomalous craft, objects, metallic craft hovering over the community. And they were lights as well that were moving at incredibly rapid speeds. And George Jones was sent out to investigate as a young squadron leader because of the coverage at the time. And I found the local newspaper references to this investigation. It was never resolved. And George Jones later on in life admitted that as a pilot himself, he'd seen strange objects while he was flying. And he went on to become Australia's Chief of Air Staff, the head of the Air Force in Australia. And more importantly, he also ran a UFO organisation when he was in civilian life after retirement. So there's those stories as well, and it fascinated me, that history. And then I loved, when I was a little boy, I just loved reading The Lonely Sea in the Sky, which is a beautiful autobiography written by a British sailor called Francis Chichester, now known as Sir Francis Chichester, who's since passed on. But he was a legend because he'd sailed this little boat called Gypsy Moth, I think it was. It might have been the plane, but he flew around the world and he sailed around the world. And in the plane that he was flying, when he was flying across the Tasman in the 1930s, he saw what sounds like a Tic Tac, a cylindrical, tubular sort of shaped object that came out of nowhere, dazzled him with its luminescence. And he couldn't explain what it was, but as he acknowledged in his autobiography, it appeared to be what people these days would call a flying saucer. And it fascinated me that Australia's recent history, going back to the 1930s, was recording these incidents. And then when I started going through the files of the aptly named DAFI, the Department of Air Force Intelligence in Australia, God knows why they ever gave themselves that name. DAFI had numerous filings reports and sightings reports that showed that there was a real concern about anomalous objects that were being seen all across Australia. And one of the ones that really caught my eye was in the period, I think it was about 3 or 4 weeks prior to the Roswell sighting in 1947. There were so many sightings. I think there were 3 independent sightings of 5 egg-shaped objects that came up out of the ocean near Flinders Ranges in South Australia. And these egg-shaped objects were apparently intelligently controlled craft. They were seen by 3 independent sets of witnesses, each of whom corroborated each other about the size and the shape and the incredible speeds of what they saw. And it just fascinated me that these objects were being seen in that period immediately prior to what we now know as the mythical Roswell sighting. And like practically every sighting in the history, especially when the British moved in and they very kindly decided to let their nuclear bombs off in South Australia, leaving the place a complete bloody mess. There's this huge, big, empty area of desert in South Australia that the British and their benevolence decided to use for nuclear weapons testing after the Second World War. And during those nuclear tests, the number of sightings of strange, anomalous craft or objects or lights was just extraordinary. And they were all reported because this was a highly secure range with top-of-the-line 1940s radar. These objects were being tracked flying in many cases at thousands of miles an hour. And there was a genuine security concern that some foreign nation might be monitoring the British nuclear testing. And a lot of work was put into investigating these incidents. And funnily enough, when I was investigating for my research, I actually found a very old gentleman who remembered being at some of these tests in the 1960s. I think they were rocket tests at the Woomera rocket range. And he told me that he was scrambled because he was a physicist, and he was scrambled to go and investigate a local woman who'd been walking with her dog, and she claimed to have seen a tripod-shaped craft, a tripod-legged craft with a big egg shape, landing in scrub near the rocket range facility. And it was quite funny because when I looked at the sightings report and compared it, oh gosh, what's the name of that patrolman who saw an egg-shaped object?
Lonnie Zamora?
Zamora, Yeah. It's almost an identical rendition of the Zamora incident. And essentially, there was this tripod-legged, egg-shaped craft that had landed in bushland near the Woomera rocket testing range. And he got there too late to actually see the craft, but when he interviewed the woman and she took him to the place where this object had allegedly landed, he found and recorded the indentations of the tripod feet. And it really struck me when I looked at the files of the Zamora incident, the Long Zamora incident, the similarities between that object and what this person had seen in the 1940s or 50s. And it's quite astonishing because, we've all been told, especially since Project Blue Book in 1969 was shut down, we've all been told that UAPs, UFOs, they're not a national security issue, they're not a flight safety issue, they're not really an area of concern at all, and you can treat them with a degree of visible contempt or mockery because, frankly, it's all rubbish. Authoritative scientists say so, end of story. And it fascinated me to see that in the historical record of the incredibly secret, formerly once incredibly secret archives of our Defence Department, there was indeed a huge body of evidence, as there is in your archives, to show that science was taking it incredibly seriously indeed. And there was a huge concern about these objects that were clearly breaching airspace in highly sensitive military areas. And more importantly, there was a clear expression of concern that these were a potential national security issue, as indeed, 76 years later, the report to the Congress has essentially acknowledged.
And one of the things you moved on to into the book, you went into Roswell. Well, let me get back to what you just said. One thing, as far as military, whether or not there's a cover-up, and then people also talk about the media cover-up, and I know you believe that it's more of a stigma issue with the media, but what is your opinion on, a lot of people have written and spoken about Project Mockingbird, where the CIA infiltrated the media and put people into certain places covering, trying to manage the news. Do you think that may be going on now as far as, managing the news? And we've spoken about maybe there is some influence with certain defense reporters, maybe, trying to placate their sources, maybe with the 2020 New York Times article, because I think we both know there was a lot more to that article that did not make it in. I mean, we know, unfortunately, when Ralph Blumenthal went live on Facebook by mistake, he was talking about Wilson Davis. So they looked into that. I know they looked into the 1961 MJ-12 document, which never made it in. So how much management? I know you said you don't think there's a conspiracy in the media, and I agree with you, but how much management do you think there's going on at the higher levels, like something at the New York Times?
Look, I'll be honest with you, I truly don't believe that there are agents of our intelligence services going around gagging editors in newspapers. I suspect there might have been. I think the evidence is strong to show that back in the 50s and the 60s, there was an intelligence service presence in media organisations. And I'm aware of the fact that our public broadcaster in Australia, it had tacit links with the intelligence services so that it made it very hard, especially during the Cold War, for journalists to break stories that were nationally sensitive because they were all vetted by a D-notice committee under a very British system. It was kind of like, old chap, please bring me your stories that might expose issues of national security and we'll tell you whether or not you can run them. And I know that's changed because when I worked for the public broadcaster, I did a big expose on our equivalent of the CIA, which infuriated our government and very narrowly avoided me getting prosecuted for supposedly revealing national security secrets. But, there was a huge royal commission and it exposed all manner of issues and problems in our intelligence services, which were remedied as a result. But to be honest with you, as a journalist who's covered national security, intelligence and defence issues, the bigger issue, frankly, with UFOs is the stigma and the contempt and the ridicule that's attached to the subject, such that editors are acculturated to treat the subject with taboo. They just don't think that UFOs are a story. And this permeates not just newspapers and television, but also the entire media and publishing industry. I can tell you it's been a hard road to persuade a major publisher like HarperCollins, to their credit, to take this issue seriously and to let a journalist like me write a book, which is a serious insect journalist's take on the UAP phenomenon. And I was laughing this morning because even Amazon categorized my book under UFOs and New Age, and I was
Yeah, I saw that.
in the Strand Books, one of my favourite bookshops in the world, in New York a few weeks ago, and it's on Fifth Avenue. It's the world's biggest bookshop, I think, but it's just such a magnificent bookshop. Love it. But I was infuriated because I was trying to find the UFO section, and I said to them, I said, "Where's your UFO section?" And then they gave me this kind of weird look, "Oh, you're one of those." And I was shown into the fantasy section of Strand Books, right up the back with all the dirty books and all the weird sort of psychological New Age mysticism books. And I actually said to the guy who showed me, I said, "Why do you put all the UFO books here?" And he went, "That's where we put all the weird shit." You know, and I think there is a stigma, and I think, frankly, that's the bigger issue. I am aware, and I've written about it in my book, I am aware that there was historically intelligence service meddling in the phenomenon, in trying to suppress public coverage and awareness of it, to the extent that if you go to the CIA's library, and there are books that have been written about this issue, creditable books that I think tell the story much better than I do. The CIA made a conscious decision to shut down public awareness of UFOs. A decision was made that this was a subject matter that was best not publicly discussed. And so they adopted a deliberate policy of stigmatizing and ridiculing the subject. And that's the problem. That's the problem at the desk level in a newspaper, that when a reporter like me would walk in and say, "I've got a UFO story or a story about an anomalous phenomenon or an object that's been seen in the sky," the default mode inside that newspaper was to treat it with extreme ridicule and skepticism, to the extent that, as happened to Dave Fravor and the pilots on the USS Nimitz, people would wear tinfoil hats or leave a tinfoil hat on your desk. It's there's something about it that invites ridicule. And the irony is, the thing that I find fascinating, I've realized there's a huge cognitive dissonance between what the public actually thinks of this subject matter and what the evidence actually shows.
No, I agree. And my first start in news was back in the 80s. And the only time I would see a UFO story was at the last 30 minutes in the United States. It's called a kicker story, and they'd play some weird music and they'd make a joke about it. And we've come a long way since then. So,
well, it was funny. I was only watching last night, Joe. There's this amazing story, and it's on YouTube. And there's a gentleman who, I think he's part of some kind of religious organization, but he's a very large African-American man, and he's wearing a robe. And the reporter is invited to a park, and the gentleman summons a UFO. Have you seen that imagery?
it's Project Yahweh. And
Yeah. And it's hilarious because, the news organization belittled the whole story. But the hilarious thing is, the guy really did apparently summons some kind of object.
Yeah, I know people. I think they were balloons. I think people have debunked him specifically, but
yeah.
But there are other people that I've seen claim to do that. George Knapp just did a report on it, an interview with 3 guys, and some of the video is really impressive. Some of it is some of the most impressive home video I've ever seen. So yeah, I'm definitely open to and when you bring up summoning, I brought it up the other day on Twitter, and somebody said, "You realize what you're saying? You're summoning," and there was a connection right away to demons. So I got to be careful what I say. But your book, you talk about Roswell, and I know a lot of people know about Roswell, but I want to talk about some of the things a lot of people don't know, and a lot of things I didn't know. I've heard of Wilbur Smith, I've heard of Frank Scully, but can you talk about Scully, his book, and Wilbur Smith, and then more importantly, Robert Sarbacher? That's a name a lot of people in our field do not know, except for the long timers who have studied this.
Yeah, well, Wilbur Smith, of course, as you know, was a Canadian guy who claimed repeatedly in his lifetime to have stumbled across evidence of the American retrieval of a UFO program and its attempts to re-engineer it. And he told his Canadian government masters in a memo that has since been declassified that it was the most secret program in the American government, much more secret even than the H-bomb. And this was a memo that was recovered, I think, actually after Smith's death. But essentially, it's been verified by his son and indeed by other people that he was indeed introduced to people in the American military industrial establishment in the 1940s and 50s who were allegedly, reportedly involved in, I've got to say it, a crash retrieval, a UFO crash retrieval program that was attempting to back engineer this technology. And one of the people who acknowledged, fascinatingly, that he'd engaged with Smith about this work was a guy called Robert Sabasha, who was a professor at a very eminent university. And as I've often found in my research, a lot of the work's been done before by very dogged and dedicated researchers in the UFO field. And he was written a letter and asked, had he engaged with the Smith character and, was he aware of this program that was going on? And Sabasha, I can't remember the exact form of words, but he basically admitted that there was this program and that he didn't understand why it was being kept secret. And I noticed that there's been other people in the American military and industrial establishment who basically acknowledged implicitly or explicitly the existence of this program, if you like, over the years. And I notice also that it's been explicitly and categorically denied by, I think, the Obama White House, among others, in a press release. And ultimately, in the face of those denials, you have evidence from people like Robert Sabacha, Wilbert Smith, and a sort of a slow concatenation of evidence that suggests that there is an alternative narrative. And look, I've been lied to before as a journalist. I've seen military cover-ups, I've seen government cover-ups. Governments do lie. It's part of running a country that sometimes you do lie to protect the national security interest. So I understand that. And I don't think it's entirely outside the realm of possibility that the American government is and has been concealing for some time some kind of secret program involving the retrieval of non-human technology. And the reason I say that is because of what I've discovered. I've talked to quite a few people in my book, and I've quoted people on the record who've made public comments, notably Lou Elizondo, Chris Mellon, Eric Davis, Dr. Eric Davis, whom I know you know. And these people are very highly regarded people who've worked inside the military industrial intelligence establishment, and they're saying the US has recovered some kind of advanced technology that may indeed, or indeed in some cases they're flatly asserting, is off this world. It's not human. I just find that amazing. And when you've got a paper of the reputation of the New York Times running a story, I think in July last year, basically saying that they're aware of allegations of recovered non-human advanced technology, of craft being recovered, this needs to be taken seriously. And the thing that really strikes me is the evidence from Wilbert Smith and Sabasha and Edgar Mitchell, the former astronaut. There's a body of evidence to support the notion that there has been recoveries. And I followed the interesting story of the history of the Aztec alleged UFO flying saucer retrieval as part of a documentary that I made in May. And I spent some time with Scott and Suzanne Ramsey and went through the evidence that they've collected, going right back to the books that were written in the 1950s that suggested that there had been crash retrievals, including a retrieval near the town of Aztec in New Mexico. And it fascinated me because I can't say I believe absolutely that a gigantic flying saucer was recovered by the US military or Air Force in that period. But I do think there's a body of evidence there that any reasonable journalist or any reasonable investigator would think amounts to a circumstantial prima facie case that should be investigated. And I don't believe it can be dismissed out of hand. And this is the thing that really shocks me, is that there was a moment in my research where I've been resisting the possibility in my head. I've been thinking, okay, I can handle the notion of possible aliens, extraterrestrials visiting planet Earth, but in my head, it just didn't seem plausible to me that the US could have recovered craft, and I kind of implicitly dismissed Roswell and Aztec and Del Rio and all of these other cases. Trinity, I noticed Jacques Vallée and Paola Harris have done their excellent book on another crash that allegedly occurred shortly after the Trinity explosion, the atomic explosion in 1945. You can't dismiss these cases out of hand because the historical record has left a trail. And there are arms of the American government that have tried to obscure that trail. They've tried to put people off. They've tried to discredit people like Frank Scully, the guy who wrote the book Behind the Flying Saucers. But the interesting thing is that I think there is evidence there that suggests that the United States government may well have recovered, as I think Chris Mellon has described it, or actually Lou Elizondo, exotic technology. And where this technology comes from, I think, is worthy of intense investigation. Is there another country in the world that has suddenly made an incredible advancement in technology to the extent that it's operating craft that appear to be capable of anti-gravitic propulsion, of extraordinary speeds and maneuvers, where the occupants of the craft don't appear to be suffering any kind of G-forces? I mean, the only plausible explanation for the kind of technology that we're seeing is that someone or something has made some kind of incredible technological advancement far beyond known human science. And that's why I find what the Pentagon has essentially admitted in the last 2 years so exciting and fascinating, because they're slowly dribbling out admissions that when you put them together, even though they're not directly saying it, when you put them together, you're led to only one logical conclusion, that there is an anomalous phenomenon occurring not only in our atmosphere, it's occurring in the water as well, underwater. I believe it's also occurring in space, in orbit. And it's displaying speeds far, far beyond known human technology, maneuvers that are impossible with classic aerospace or rocket or drone technology. It appears to be following those observables that Lou Elizondo has so well described. It's capable of stealth, it's capable of interfering electromagnetically with the radar systems, with the observational sensor systems of terrestrial technology. This is fascinating. Whatever this is, it's way, way more advanced than what we've got. So this is now an acknowledged possible, probable national security issue, officially, by the UAP task force in its advice to Congress. It's acknowledging that there's a plausible national security concern here. It is also flatly acknowledged that because of the 11 near misses that have been reported by US pilots in the 144 incidents that preliminary report did investigate, it's acknowledged that this is a flight safety issue. So there you have it. After 60 years of denials since Project Blue Book that the US is interested in UFOs, it turns out it's been investigating them all along. It turns out that the phenomenon has been a subject of very, very active interest by the US government and different agencies. And more importantly, there's a clear understanding that it represents both a flight safety and a national security concern. So why the deceit? Why the lying? And I think we're at a very interesting paradigm now, a turning point shift in thinking. And I do think that there are people in the government, in your government, and possibly also in mine, who are consciously preparing the public for further revelations.
Yeah, it does. It definitely seems that way. And as far as crash retrieval, I told people a couple of years ago when Eric Davis was working for Earth Tech and Hal Puthoff, I asked him, and I told people I would give the answer. I said, as far as the crash retrieval program, how confident are you that it's real on a scale of 1 to 10? and how many others are as confident as you? And I haven't shared this before, but I feel comfortable sharing this. He said, on a scale of 1 to 10, 100. And he said several others, most dead now, are 100 on the same scale. So it's like, I see that. I see the comments by Christopher Mellon, by Luis Elizondo. I see the Sarbaca comments. There's so much smoke. We don't have the fire. We don't have the craft. And I know for you, you and I do. I want to see it too. I can't say I know that we have a craft. I do believe we have more than materials. But it's funny to watch you. You talk about, and you've spoken to so many people who have shared information, sources, but you're still hesitant. I see it when you say, you're like, I hate to say it, but crash retrievals. And is
Well,
that
the reason
because
why
of your history? Yeah, go ahead. Sorry.
I've been on the receiving end of government disinformation in the past. I've stumbled across things that I shouldn't have stumbled across. I once stumbled across a thing that our government was involved in where we were disrupting people smugglers operating in Indonesia, bringing refugee aspirants across the straits from Indonesia to Australia. And our intelligence services were basically working with the Indonesians to run what was essentially quite a dirty little operation to stop boats from leaving Indonesia. And I suspect that involved the sinking of boats on occasion in port, not killing people at sea. But I do think that there was this dirty operation going on, and I kind of stumbled across it. And I think one of the most scary times as a journalist was when I realized that I was on the receiving end of essentially a black disinformation operation by people in our intelligence services who decided to take me out. And I was the subject of false allegations that I'd paid witnesses to give evidence that was false. And, it was horrible. It was a really, really nasty time. And I realized, wow, when the state wants to stop something coming out, especially a black operation, they'll do anything. And it was a really sobering experience for me. And I was the father of young children, and I was scared. I was really scared. And I've spoken to people in the course of my research who have told me that they are on what they refer to as the program, that they're scientists or people in the military who have been involved in compartmentalized efforts to reproduce technology or to secure technology that they believe is of non-human origin. And frankly, I believe there's a body of evidence to support the fact that the US government has been lying for probably 7 decades since World War II to conceal stuff that it has recovered. But frankly, because of the risk of disinformation, because I've seen before lies being told to push a military or a national security imperative, I will never believe it for absolute certain until I'm literally looking at that TR-3B or that alien reproduction vehicle sitting in a hover in a cave somewhere in Area 51 with glowing luminescent purple lights underneath it, and scientists basically pushing buttons to figure out how it works. Because frankly, there's always the risk that even though I followed quite a clever strategy to try and engage people directly, to invite them to talk to me about what they allegedly knew, there's always the risk that I'm the victim of a concerted government disinformation program, that the Americans, for example, are trying to leave their rivals with a perception that they're more advanced than they really are. And I suppose my default is, I think the Americans have recovered technology. I don't know whether that involves craft necessarily, but I do believe they've recovered technology that they believe is not human. I don't care if people laugh at that. I know it, to be honest. I know it's for real. I've been told it by too many people. The issue in my mind, and I think this is where your friend and somebody I respect enormously, Dr. Eric Davis, comes in, the guy who's now working for Aerospace Corporation. So he's still got a top secret SCI clearance. He's still somebody who's respected and is protected and within the national security infrastructure of America, respected as somebody who's knows what he's doing. He has gone on the record to talk about crashed, recovered, and landed UFO technology. He's basically flatly asserted that there are off-world craft that are held by America. And I've spoken to people in the Congress who are aware of briefings that were given by Dr. Eric Davis and others who've told the Congress that the United States is in possession of non-terrestrial technology, off-world vehicles. That's mind-blowing. And this is the thing that I find interesting is, I mean, I've had conversations with journalists from Washington, D.C. who rang me confidentially. I also had a conversation a couple of days ago with a British journalist who rang me who was also, interestingly, chasing this issue. And there's the beginning of an engagement with this area where journalists are sort of nervously putting their toes in the water going, gosh, this is really interesting, you know, as Ross has pointed out, because a couple of them have read my book and they've gone, gee, when you actually look at the evidence, Ross has got a point. You know, there is a circumstantial case to show that there really potentially is something to this. And so what's stopping them, though, what's still hindering them is that fear that they're going to be bollocksed or ridiculed for revealing what they know. I don't think there are men in black sitting in their editor's office saying, you shall not run this story. I still think that's quite possible, though. But I think also one of the problems that stops the media from engaging this and taking it seriously is it's a huge problem in mass media. Mass media tends to think in a pack. Witness what happened with the failure to question about weapons of mass destruction going into the Iraq War. You know, we all in the media glibly accepted the assurances that we were given by General Colin Powell, and so did he for that matter. He was given them by the CIA and apparently flatly lied to. You know, our intelligence services essentially, or your and our intelligence services, probably in a kind of a mass groupthink, colluded in self-deception. And if that can happen, they're also capable, I think, of deceiving the media about a covert UFO crash retrieval program. And I think one of the things that the media need to start doing is looking at the breadcrumbs, looking at the trail and actually saying, look, there's something more to this. You know, Coulthart's got a point. Joe Murguy's got a point. There really is a body of circumstantial evidence to show that historically a lot of creditable people with reputations have come out and basically said, there's something to this crash retrieval issue. And instead of giggling and sort of ridiculing and treating with taboo and stigma this issue every time it's raised, I think it's time people seriously started asking questions at White House press conferences. You know, Mr. President, what are you going to be doing about the UAP report? Mr. President, there are allegations on the public record from public officials who have said that the US has recovered non-human technology. What do you say to that? Do you deny it?
Yeah, he's been asked. He's only been asked once, and he laughed and walked away, and he said, "Ask Obama." So it's like that was disappointing. And I'm hoping your book opens the door for more mainstream journalists, national level journalists, and it has, but it's died down again, which we always see. We see the ebb and flow, and right now it's there's a it's an ebb. It's at a lull right now. But your book just came out.
I know. I actually know a lot's going on. I think one of the things that's going to be interesting to watch is we've got this. I think that there is an indication that there's going to be a further report from the UAP task force. But I mean, for anybody listening to this, the thing I'm really worried about is we've seen this issue shut down before. I mean, the US Air Force very successfully shut down Project Blue Book in the late 1960s. You know, the public has been very, very effectively snowed for much of the past 70 years. It could happen again. You know, I don't think that this is yet engaging in the mainstream in a way that means that there's momentum in the Congress to actually get public hearings. I'm very skeptical about that.
I am too.
I know Lou Elizondo and Chris Mellon are pushing, but from my reading of the different senators and congressmen who've basically made public comments about this, my attempt to kind of feel the pulse of other people in that place, I don't get the impression that this is a political imperative, especially not at a time of grave sensitivities with China, because, you know, essentially, you know, if we are slowly drifting into a confrontation with China, then I can understand why the military defence establishment might want to keep secret technologies that it's developing in the black.
And I know a lot of people are going to hate me for this, but when I was reading your book, I'm reading about, and let's talk about, go back a little bit, Roscoe Hillenkotter, because as I'm reading about him and NICAP, I wrote down in big letters, I'm like, Hillenkotter is Elizondo. I mean, the similarities, it's, and I heard you talk about it yesterday,
Yeah.
and I was like, I can't believe, and how did I miss that? The similarities, and other people have mentioned it, so I'm not the first person. So that does
No,
concern me.
that's what amazes me is when I actually went through your history, your defence archives. It's amazing to me that the history shows that there were very, very senior officials, former admirals, former generals, senior people in your Navy in particular, like Roscoe Hillenkotter, who took a position. They were aware of anomalous phenomenon that had been seen by their flight crews, and they were determined to do something about it. And this is a guy who was the founding director of your CIA. He created your overseas spy service. This is a guy who was one of the heroes of Pearl Harbor and went on to become I think he was the captain of USS Missouri, a very, very highly respected pillar of your military establishment, happens to have been a huge proponent of expose of what he believes was some kind of UFO cover-up going on inside the US government. And there were multiple people like him who took a position. And you can see in the history books, they were slowly marginalized. Another guy I suspect has been shut down, and I've reached out to him on multiple occasions, is Richard D'Amato, who was a former senior staffer on the Senate Intelligence Committee, and he's mentioned a lot in Jacques Vallée's Forbidden Science diaries, which record Jacques Vallée's conversations over many, many years with people interested in the UFO phenomenon. And Richard D'Amato was a senior staffer on the Senate Intelligence Committee back in the 1970s, making a huge effort to try and crack what he clearly believed was to use my friend Steve Bassett's term, a truth embargo inside the US government that was blocking the public from knowing what was really going on. And he clearly has been shut down. I mean, he now has a statement on his website where he basically says that he's got nothing more to add, and that he feels nothing could be advanced by taking this any further inside the inside the Congress. So what's going on? Why is it that people like that periodically bob their heads up and basically make statements that they think that the US government is hiding stuff, and then they slowly disappear? And I think that could happen again. I can tell you, seeing the pressure that Lou Elizondo was and is under when I visited him in May, especially when the guy's copying it from UFO Twitter as much as he's copying it from the defence, black elements of the Defence Force. This is a guy who's risked a lot. He's sacrificed a lot to go public and to tell the American public that he believes the American government is hiding stuff and that there needs to be accountability and transparency. And for a lot of his efforts, he's copping a bollocksing for it, as we say in Australia. He's just, it's making his life very miserable. I can imagine what he would quite like to do is retire to his farm in the Midwest there and put his feet up and work on his motorbikes and just enjoy life a bit. And the thing is, it's a thankless job if you're a public official and you go against the grain and basically speak up. And even Eric Davis, I noticed that all of the interviews and all of the commentary that he'd given on this issue occurred before he went back into the defence world, presumably under a compartmentalised intelligence restraint, which essentially stops him from speaking publicly. Aerospace Corporation, where he's working, is a federally funded research organisation. And it's amazing to me that somebody like Eric, a man of great reputation, undoubted ability, undoubted scientific expertise, can make the assertion that he believes the US has recovered alien craft That's fundamentally what he's saying. And it goes out there and it disappears. That's it. I wait to see. I mean, one of the things a lot of people have said is how good it is that the New York Times has run what it has run. And it is good, but I'm also aware, as you are, of stuff that Leslie Kane and Ralph Blumenthal have talked about, particularly in the social media forums that they've engaged with off the main pages of the newspaper. And Ralph Blumenthal particularly has hinted very strongly that he thinks that the United States has recovered craft technology. This is an eminent reporter for the New York Times newspaper. Senior officials in your military, industrial, scientific establishment, Lou Elizondo, Chris Mellon, Eric Davis, and others that I've spoken to have indicated there's something to this. Even President Obama, former President Obama, when he was doing an interview just very recently, he dropped a huge hint that this is worthy of intense investigation. And even Trump, your former president until earlier this year, he did that interview with his son Don Jr., where he was asked about Roswell, and he indicated that he had been briefed about Roswell, that he knew something about Roswell that he couldn't reveal, but he was minded to in the future. I've spoken to people in your government who tittered nervously about Trump because they were really worried he was going to say stuff that he shouldn't have. And ultimately, at the bottom of all of this, Joe, I have this suspicion. I like to think the best of the people that run our defence intelligence establishment. I don't think they're evil people. I've been privileged when I did the communications surveillance story on the Echelon communications system. I was privileged to engage with your NSA and also with our Australian Signals Directorate, then the Defence Signals Directorate. And rather than block me off, they engaged with me as a serious insect journalist. And I was concerned, for example, that the communications surveillance system, I'd been fed a line that America might be misusing this tapping technology for economic advantage, that Australia might be losing contracts because America was essentially using this awesome spy system to gain an edge in giving its companies an advantage against Australian companies. And so I was questioning as a journalist, why are we part of this Five Eyes alliance? And so I was shown or given a briefing about the tasking for the Geraldton satellite interception that the Yakuza Echelon system operated over the Indian Ocean that was tapping essentially into North Korean communications. And I could see that what we were doing was fundamentally good stuff. We were essentially monitoring, and I'd known this already because I'd spoken to my own sources in the intelligence services who'd given me their own take on this. And I like to think in a similar way that the reasons why there is a cover-up, and there is a cover-up, I like to think that there's some reason that this is being kept secret. It's more than just embarrassment. Because the one thing that worries me is that it was kept secret for a whole series of slightly lame reasons through the Cold War. That, we didn't want to alarm the public. We had religious objections to revealing the existence of extraterrestrials, if that's the case. That essentially we didn't want to confuse early warning systems by having too many public sightings of anomalous objects that we knew were others. Is it plausible that benign explanation is the more plausible explanation? Or is it that the military just simply doesn't like admitting that there is a technology that is far more advanced than theirs that is operating on our planet? Or is it that we are developing technology in the black, which we haven't cracked yet, but we're very, very close to cracking? And we don't want to give our adversaries in those authoritarian regimes, such as Russia, such as China, we don't want to give them a strategic advantage by being forced to reveal what we do have or what you, the American government, do have. I don't know which one of those to think, but I like to think the best possible interpretation, because I don't think these are bad people. Yeah, you get some rotten generals and rotten admirals and rotten Air Force officers, And yes, there are people, I suspect, in the Air Force who are just kind of dampen the whole thing down and would rather it just all went away and continue doing what they've been doing for the last 50 to 70 years. But I do think, and the evidence is borne out by the WikiLeaks emails from the DNC database, the emails that show the links between Tom DeLonge, the punk rock star, a couple of generals, a guy from Lockheed Martin Skunk Works, and John Podesta, Hillary Clinton's campaign manager. I do think the evidence shows that there was some in the military who were prepared to engage to discuss disclosure with Hillary Clinton as a Hillary Clinton disclosure presidency. And that's fascinating to me, the fact that there are people in our military who are prepared to consider transparency and accountability. What I don't understand is why it's still kept secret. And, normally a journo like me, operating at the levels that I've been operating at, I've engaged with some very, very senior people in your government. And normally I would have been taken aside at some stage and told, if there was a national security concern, I would have been told, look, Ross, the reason we can't reveal this is because of X, Y, Z. And that hasn't happened. And so ultimately, I am led to the view that this is just a big embarrassment for our military, your military, that essentially this has been kept secret for far too long. The reasons why they've kept it secret are now unsustainable and implausible. And it's time it was brought out. And who gives a toss if a few generals and Air Force officers along the way might be court-martialed and hung, drawn and quartered for lying and deceiving the Congress and lying to presidents, if that's the case.
What if you were pulled aside? Because I know you've spoken about this before, and they said, Ross, this is the reason it's being kept secret. We need you to not report this. And they show you something, and it's just so troubling. It's something that's the majority of human beings would not be able to handle. Would you keep that if they said, here you go, but we would wish that you do not release this because it could cause havoc on the globe? Would you keep it to yourself, or would you not report that? Would you consider that enough of a national security issue?
I think just because people might get upset by the revelation isn't a reason to keep it secret. I think I'd need some very strong evidence to explain to me why it should be kept secret. I mean, I'll give you an example, Joe. I mean, I've stumbled. I worked as a foreign correspondent for a while, and I knew the names of the CIA station agents that were operating in a particular country. I could have, I suppose, compromised them and the names of Australian and New Zealand intelligence officers that were operating in what I knew was an operation that was operating for both of our countries' mutual interest. But I chose not to because I'm a patriotic person. I think that we are engaged as a country, as an alliance, in a much more serious and sober clash with authoritarian regimes and downright evil terrorist regimes than I think publicly many of our governments care to admit. And yes, there is a need for national security restraints on what is published. We don't want to compromise the names of intelligence officials. I don't want to compromise ongoing intelligence operations. And I don't think, though, that's an excuse to conceal something that's embarrassing or which is distressing. As I say in my book, we can handle the truth. This isn't a Colonel Jessup situation where, the public can't handle the truth. We really can. If this is something that is purely just going to be confronting to religious people, it might challenge our spiritual notions of ourselves as human beings, our exceptionalism as human beings. That's not an adequate excuse. I'd take some persuading, I suppose, that it's necessary for this to be kept secret. But if, for example, let's assume that there's a problem in developing this technology, because that's what Eric suggested. Eric Davis has said, I think, in a number of interviews that efforts to re-engineer this technology stopped around 1989 at the end of the Cold War, which I don't believe.
Yeah, Eric says that, and there are other people who say that. But then you have Will Miller, who I interviewed, and he's like, oh no, we've got these craft. He's been talking about that for a long time. He's like, we have craft that can go anywhere, any place, anytime in the universe. So I think, do you agree with this? If we have that type of technology, any level between, just some progress to compare to what Will Miller says, where we've mastered it, Do you think that would be more classified than just if ETs were visiting? Because I think it would be if we
Yeah,
had
yeah.
that tech.
I think, frankly, I don't think most humans would be surprised if there were other life forms. I think we've been being prepared for it through popular culture for much of the last 40 or 50 years. Our society is obsessed. We're fascinated with the idea that there might be other life forms. And I think largely we tend to see it as benevolent, even though Hollywood spent a large amount of money in the last few years trying to scare the hell out of us. Armageddon, Independence Day. The notion that aliens might be a threat, I think most people don't really think that. One of my favourite movies is Arrival, which I think is brilliant. Really encapsulates, in my mind, the notion that whatever it is, the intelligence that is out there, and I think there is one, I'm sure there is, whatever it is, part of the issue for us is communication, just understanding how to communicate with it. But let's come back to a moment for what you're talking about. Yes, if the US is developing this technology in the black, if there is, and I think there is, a huge black program that's trying to develop this technology, I would keep that secret as long as I could. And one of the things that has crossed my mind, and I start my book with an incident in Northwest Cape in 1991, where an Australian woman was travelling in the company of two security policemen from our federal police service from a US base, a classified, highly top secret US base way up in Northwest Cape in Australia's northwest in Western Australia. And it's a base that's targeting submarines with communications signals from a huge VLF, very low frequency array that's erected hundreds of metres into the air in this piece of barren land nowhere in Australia. And it communicates with submarines, notably in the event of nuclear war. It's where your American government sends out the signals to launch the missiles. And it can send these signals underwater, thereby protecting the submarines from detection by Russian satellites. And Annie saw a huge triangular black craft hovering over their car early one morning as she was driving back from this base with these two policemen. And it was a craft that was intelligently controlled, that displayed speeds and manoeuvres that were just mind-boggling to her. But the thing that I think about that incident fascinates me the most is the Americans weren't so much interested in what she could tell them about the object. They were more interested in her not talking about it and her walking away with the delusion that it was a weather balloon. They were trying to shut her down, and implicitly there was the threat that she shouldn't talk about it. And certainly the two policemen that she was with were bullied and intimidated into keeping quiet about what they saw. They genuinely feared for their lives. And I'm very speculating in my head, but I'm very much of the view that I think it's possible the US has been testing technology that it used to test at Area 51 in northwestern Australia, in one of the most remote parts of the world, at this secure base that had operated until 1991. And I don't think it's any coincidence that in and around that time, this is when George Knapp was breaking the revelations about Area 51 being used for testing new and interesting craft. You've got the Bob Lazar allegations, make what you want of those. But essentially, Area 51 was blown as a secret Nevada test range. You couldn't fly exotic aerospace craft anymore in and around there without Jim Goodall and others having huge lenses at the end of runways, catching snaps of what was coming out. And so I don't think it's inconceivable at all that what the US was demanding to do was to find a different location. And the way in which the investigations into that triangular UFO incident in 1991, the way those investigations went, suggests to me that it wasn't a surprise to the US what was seen by this person. What was a concern was her talking about it, making the public aware of it. And there's a question mark in my mind, is the US testing technology in the black in different parts of the world? I do think it's possible that Australia has been used for that. whether our government knows about that or not.
It's one of
And
the
then
comments.
that suggests that possibly we are testing, or you are testing, technology that the world doesn't yet know about. Which, frankly, if I was the US Air Force, I'd want to keep secret. You know, in the event of a war, one of the fundamental principles of warfighting is surprise. You know, you don't want your enemy to know what your capabilities are. And is it outside the realm of possibility that the US has and is developing anti-gravitic propulsion technology and awesome in energy systems and awesome stealth systems in the black that they haven't yet publicly disclosed? Yes, I do. I sincerely hope that that's the case. I really do hope that the US is out there doing it, because I'd rather it's the US than China or Russia. God help us all if they are.
Yeah, and along the lines of whether or not we have developed that technology, you know, I met Will Miller back in 2000. I didn't realize how important of a player he was back then. And one of the things he said during his interviews, he said he met somebody, he had a friend who worked at Area 51, and as the guy was leaving, or as Will was leaving, he said, the guy took him aside and said, you know, Will, some of the folks you talk with, maybe some CSETI researchers, and that was Dr. Stephen Greer's original organization, said they may see some objects that are doing, you know, Mach 9, and then suddenly make a right angle turn, and you say, well, gosh, that's gotta be an extraterrestrial craft. And then he looked at me and he said, but it's not. And he just he turned and walked away. So it's like, you know, I see that, and I'm like, maybe we do have this. And Will is somebody, he bucks. These guys will not talk about that stuff. I've had nobody else talk to me about the possibility of us having this kind of technology. But Will is, it seems like he believes he believes we have it, and he believes it's our right to know about it, and he's really pushing the edge. Obviously, I don't think he's. Yeah, go ahead.
And when you do have people like Will saying that, I mean, he was, I know, part of the meeting with Stephen Greer that went into the Pentagon to talk to Tom Wilson in 2002. You know, the original meeting where allegedly the then Deputy Director of the Defence Intelligence Agency learned for the first time about the existence of secret UFO retrieval programs inside the military complex that he was part of, and which he as a J2 had not been briefed on, if that's true. But what's interesting is I noticed Will Miller's sort of pulled his punches since. He's kept quiet since. And look, I like to think, you know, I mean, just coming back for a moment to your question, if somebody from the US government or my government contacted me and said, look, Ross, we want you to know that we have this technology, but you can't report this part of it, because to do that would compromise an operation or a national security concern. Every journalist would weigh the public interest before determining whether or not they should publish. You have to do that. I mean, I've been confronted. I can remember once I was doing an investigation into alleged corruption inside our tax office. And this is well before the days of WikiLeaks and things like that. But I'd never been leaked an entire database before. But I'd run a couple of stories about how there were organised crime figures from the Italian 'Ndrangheta mafia who were actually working in the tax office and who were doing dodgy things with our tax department. And one day, a high-speed tape, which was the sort of top backup system of the time, a lunchbox full of high-speed tapes arrived in a post-pack envelope in my office. And I'd never seen these type of tapes before, and there was only one place in the entire TV network where I worked where we could actually view these tapes. And we could only view it for half an hour because it was where the corporate backup for the whole network was done, inside this temperature-controlled silo inside the network, which was a secure room. And so the head of IT took me in and we plugged in one of these tapes, and we started looking at it on a screen, and we realized that what I was looking at were the unsecured, unencrypted names and addresses and tax details of very respectable VIP public figures, politicians, rock stars, celebrities all over Australia. And it was their tax records. I saw some very famous Hollywood actors' names in there. And we scanned through it for 20 minutes. And then I looked at him and I said, well, I shouldn't have these. And he said, no, you shouldn't. And I said, I can think of about 20 different laws that we've committed breaches of by just because the tax office in Australia, and I'm sure it's the same with your tax office in America, it's merciless in protecting the private records of citizens, and so it should be. I wouldn't want my tax records out there, and you wouldn't want yours. And so I realised that what had happened was incredibly back in those days, companies, including the tax office, did corporate backups of their IT systems, and they would literally leave the backups in the foyer of the tax office for pickup by the courier that afternoon. And it would just be an anonymous lunchbox that was left in a corner of the foyer, and the motorcycle courier would come in. And it turned out the security guards just couldn't be bothered handling the paperwork at the desk, so they just left it in front of the foyer, and these guys in a helmet would come in and just grab the box and go off. And so I never found out who the source was, but some source had realised that was going on, and they'd thought, I'm going to piss off the tax office, and they flogged the lunchbox. And so they'd literally flogged the lunchbox by just walking in with a helmet on their head. I was told by my sources in the tax office when they reviewed the CCTV vision, that's exactly what happened, because they couldn't identify the guy. And I basically said to the tax office, look, I'm giving you this box back. I'm not going to do a story about it. I haven't kept a backup copy, and I shouldn't have that information. And as a journalist, I could have generated 1,000 stories out of the information that had been leaked. But I took the decision that the laws are so punitive, the public interest is so immense, I shouldn't have that information. Did I do the wrong thing? Some people might say that, but I actually don't think I did. I'm glad I gave it back.
Yeah, you're one of the good people.
Yeah, but I think occasionally in national security issues, if the US has developed anti-gravitic technology in the black, and if we are headed for a confrontation in the Taiwan Strait with China, I bloody want the Americans to have that technology. Scare the living daylights out of anyone that takes them on. Because my countrymen, I've got friends that fly fighter aircraft with the Australian Air Force. I don't want them killed in a stupid war. I've got mates that have fought for the special forces in Iraq and Afghanistan with your soldiers in Delta and the SEAL teams, and I don't want them hurt any more than is absolutely necessary in order to secure our national interest. So, yeah, I accept as a journalist that occasionally things have to be kept secret, and I've stumbled across things like that in my time as a journalist, and I've kept quiet about them. But in this case, I see no evidence that this deserves to be kept secret. If national security journalists are being told that, none of the people that I've spoken to have told me that they understand there's a good reason as to why this is being kept secret. I don't think the reason's a good one. I just think it's simple embarrassment.
Right.
And I think there's a bunch of people at high levels in the Pentagon, and more likely, I suspect, in private aerospace, who are guiding this secret, who realise they've probably broken laws. I think there's been a very active attempt to mislead the public, to lie to the public, to lie to your Congress. And I think on occasion crimes have been committed to conceal this secret. And I think a lot of people are very nervous about the consequences of what happens if this comes out. They're trying to control the narrative. One of the things I suspect is going on is they're trying to present it as if it all started in 2004. That way they can avoid any discussions about embarrassing things like recovered craft and recovered technology. Because I think that they have recovered technology. I don't think there's too much doubt in my mind about that. But I don't think they want to admit that. So it's easier for them to say, hey, you know what? People like Dave Fravor are right. We have discovered these anomalous objects are real. I know we always thought they were nonsense, but it turns out they are real. And by golly, we're going to investigate them. And we're going to humour the public by setting up a UAP task force, which is essentially window dressing. And meanwhile, very active investigations that have been going on for years behind the scenes are going to continue.
Along those lines, why would they keep it secret? It's funny because, there's so many possibilities. One of the things George Knapp spoke about a lot of people, I think it's from 2007, 2008. He said he spoke to somebody who was in Congress, either working for Congress or in Congress. I think they were in Congress. And that person said the reason it's kept secret is because a lot of people are going to go to prison for stealing money, doing things that were illegal budget-wise. And it wasn't because the secret was just horrendous for people to handle. It's all about stuff like that. That's what that person...
Yeah, but it's really interesting, Joe, because one of the first questions I asked both Lou Elizondo and Chris Mellon was, I presented them with the fact that there's clearly a cover-up going on. And I said, let's hypothetically assume that this has been kept secret illegally. And they said, well, why illegally? What's illegal about lying to Congress? Governments lie all the time. And the reality is, lying's not illegal. It's not illegal to mislead a congressman. There's no law that says, it's possibly a contempt of the Congress if the Congress is asked a specific question. But how many times has your Congress or our Parliament prosecuted somebody for lying to the Parliament or lying to the Congress? The reality is that, there's behaviour like the kind of AFOSI, Office of Air Force Special Investigations misbehaviour, where they've actively, perpetrated, I think, intelligence operations, arguably illegally, against people like Paul Benowitz. I don't think there's any doubt that intelligence services have been deployed illegally on American soil, domestic operations of the CIA and the National Security Agency against American citizens in order to protect the secret. I suspect that will come out. But really, in the long run, a lot of what's been done has been done in the national interest. And if you can do things under an executive order, under your constitution, the president can authorize pretty much anything.
For people who have not heard the story, I really make sure we got to get to the story of the man who called you in the park and the man who said, ask the question, Ross, ask the question. We need if you could go ahead, sorry.
I sat down at the very beginning of all of this and I asked myself the question which any journalist like me always asks, which is, how do you begin to investigate something which, if it's true, is being kept incredibly secret by the US government? Because my reading had convinced me, and my viewing and reading and just talking to various people had convinced me that there really is something to this. But I wanted to take it further. I wanted to advance it. And so I sat down and I went through defense reports, books, inquiries, and I thought about all of the people who could potentially help me if they were engaged with in a way that protected their anonymity. And so I thought about the fact that I know about how easy it is to track metadata of digital communications. Essentially, these mobile phones, there's nothing you can do with mobile phones. They're totally insecure. And if anybody thinks they can communicate as a journalist on a mobile phone or by email or by any kind of comms on a mobile, you're screwed. You're immediately compromising your source. So I wrote letters. I sat down and I figured out the home addresses of people all over North America and in different parts of the world who I suspected might have known something about this issue. And with the help of some good people in the US. Sorry?
Sorry, I'm talking to the dog. Go ahead.
Okay, sorry. And so I basically wrote letters to people, and I invited them to correspond with me on Telegram, which is an encrypted app, or Signal, another encrypted app, or on PGP encryption, or Proton Mail, or just to give me a letter back. And after a few months, people did. They started responding. And some of those people, one of them in particular, who was one of the first to call me, he called me on my Signal app. And I could hear, he was clearly in a park or something, because I could hear birds and I could hear kids playing. And it was his lunch hour. And he come out from the aerospace contractor complex where he was working, where he told me he worked on what he called the program. And he purported to be working on recovered technology in a very compartmentalized area of that classified operation. And he was absolutely terrified to make sure that, whilst I knew that this existed, that he not be compromised. But he thought there was a public interest in the public knowing about this. And then one of the people who called me, to my amazement, was a guy called Nat Kobitz, the former director of science and technology development for the US Navy. You know, one of the most senior geeks or research officials in the US Navy at the time. He'd retired, he'd set up his own private business, and then sadly he got very sick. He got cancer. And let me be very clear, Nat was a patriot. He absolutely loved America, and he was very, very proud of what he'd done as an American citizen, serviceman, working with the military to develop cutting-edge Navy technology. He'd been involved in early drone technology. He'd been involved in the development of the Sidewinder missile with the US Air Force and the US Navy. And as he eventually admitted to me, one day he said to me, "Ross, ask me the question." Because I told him I was interested in UFOs and what the US government knew about the phenomenon. And so I asked him the question. And one of the things that he explained to me was that a lot of these programs that he was aware of, he wouldn't talk about because he'd been read into them. He'd been security briefed into them, and he'd signed the security oath pertaining to that particular compartmentalized security information. And he made it very clear to me that he wasn't going to compromise that information, and I wasn't going to push him on it, frankly. But what was interesting was we'd kind of agreed about parameters for what he was and wasn't prepared to confirm. So I said to him, "Nat, were you ever read into any program which involved the retrieval of a UFO, flying saucer, an alien craft?" And there was this kind of pause. And I thought he wasn't going to answer the question. And I was about to ask a new question when he just went, "Yes." And I was never read out of it, so there's not much I can say. And I was just like shocked. I was really shocked. I've just got the former director of Navy Science and Technology Development, the chief geek, admitted to me that he was read into a crash retrieval program. And I went, let's be clear here, Nat. You're talking about craft. And he said, multiple craft. And that's pretty much all he was prepared to reveal. He told me he'd never seen these craft, but he told me that he was read into a craft retrieval program that he, as essentially the former head of R&D of the US Navy, had been read into while he was on the job. And one of the things I asked him was, is there an active re-engineering program where they'd actually cracked this technology? Because he acknowledged that there'd been a back engineering effort that had been going on for many, many years. He'd been briefed about it. He wouldn't exactly say when, but he'd briefed about it during his time, and that was many, many years earlier. And he went away and asked a number of his colleagues whether they were aware if this technology had been cracked in the black. And he came back to me and he said, "Ross, I don't think we've cracked anti-derivatives." He says, "I think I would know about it. I would have had to have been told about it if it had happened." And I said, "If it had happened, would you tell me about it?" And he went, "Probably not." He's a good guy. He was one of your good guys. And the thing I loved about him, he was a Brooklyn Jew, so he's a wisecracking guy with a beautiful accent. And he was just so proud of the things that he'd done with your military in 30 or 40 years working at the cutting edge of Cold War research. And he couldn't see, as the way he had explained it to me, he couldn't see any good reason why this could continue to be kept secret. The fact that they'd recovered craft. And essentially the best he would acknowledge to me was that essentially it was impossible to, what this was so advanced that their efforts to replicate it had been unsuccessful. Which kind of matched what Eric's said, if you know. That's what was significant to me. But he seems to be supporting what Dr. Eric Davis said in a number of interviews, where he said that it was essentially shut down at the end of the Cold War, which I frankly don't believe. I'm sure any re-engineering effort is continuing. But Nat was dying, and indeed he died in the course of our conversations. And, a great American patriot died with him. He was a very decent man. He became quite a good friend. But he put me on to a number of people who will remain and continue to remain anonymous and who I will protect to the end of my days, who engaged with me at Nat's instigation. And one of them had been invited onto the program and had declined, but he described the process by which people were invited onto the program. And others had been brought into the program and were operating in compartmentalized areas of the program. But I was left in no doubt whatsoever that there was a program, that the United States government was and is actively involved in an effort to re-engineer or back-engineer what it thinks is alien technology. And so the admissions that have been made by Eric Davis, Lou Elizondo, Chris Mellon, and others privately to me take on special importance when I hear what they're saying and compare it to what I was told by a man who had absolutely no reason to lie. This poor fellow was dying from a horrible cancer, and I think as one of the last gestures that he wanted to make before he passed, he wanted to be truthful with the public about something that he could see no good reason to be kept confidential for much longer. And I think that's where we're at the moment. I always try and think the best of bureaucracies, and we have a saying in my line of work, which is always assume a screw-up before a conspiracy. And so I think if there has been a conspiracy to conceal what's going on, I think it's probably an accumulation of failures by different bureaucrats to make a decision about something that was difficult to make a decision about. It's better just to put it in the too hard basket and to continue to ignore it for another 10 years than it is to come to the public and sit down in the Congress and say to the Richard D'Amatos or the Christopher Mellons, hey guys, look, we just want you to know we've been lying to you for the last 76 years. We did recover a flying saucer at Roswell in 1947, at Del Rio and at Aztec. And look, we've been trying to rebuild the bloody things for the last 76 years, but it's buggering us and we don't know how to do it. But look, we think you should know we do have this technology. I mean, I have a hunch that at some stage that might dribble out. And I think there's also significance for what it's worth in the Dr. Salvatore Pay patents that the US Navy has filed. I don't necessarily believe that the US Navy has actually achieved what it's purported to achieve, the US Patent Office. But I do think that it's interesting that an effort has been made at a point when it's known that there's potentially going to be disclosure in the Congress, that the US Navy has gone to the effort of patenting this technology through one of its doctors, one of its senior researchers. So I do think that we're slowly drifting towards a point where the public may learn something very, very interesting. And I suspect that might very well be that we learn that we are not alone, that there is an advanced intelligence that's been operating intelligence and technology in our atmosphere that's far more advanced than ours. But I'm not persuaded yet that we have this technology back-engineered and developed to the point where we can deploy it and use it in our own militaries.
Back to the gentleman who called you. How long did you speak with him? Were you able to verify anything that he said? I mean, did he tell you where he worked?
I mean, I know where he worked, but I'm not going to reveal it. I've since verified his position in the place where he works, and the role that he plays is not what he's actually told me he does. And this is one of the things, is as the guy who told me that he was invited into the program told me, the way it works is he was invited to the campus of an aerospace company. He's met at the door, taken out into the garden, they sit under a tree, and he's basically told that the United States government is working in the black on recovered alien technology. And if he's invited into the program, will he take part? He'll have an office in this building here. He'll have a secretary. He'll take calls for him. He'll put the calls through to him, but he won't be working here. He'll be working somewhere else. That's the way it works, and it's all kept very much inside private aerospace. They're not subject to the FOI laws. They're hidden behind multiple special access programs that are waived and unacknowledged. Most congressmen, most senators had absolutely no idea of it. That's the way it was described to me. Yes, I did verify what those people told me, because I believe what Nat Kobitz told me was a verification, and I've spoken since to other people who purport to have been involved in the program who also verified to me their involvement in different aspects, very heavily compartmentalised areas of the program where, for example, they're working on, for example, a piece of technology that they surmise probably came from something that is not human. I mean, imagine being given a mobile phone in the 15th century and asked to replicate that mobile phone. How would you even begin to do that? You know, the technology of silicon chips, the microscopic circuitry of an integrated circuit. How would anybody in Elizabethan England even be able to understand that? And I think that's, if this is the case, if we have recovered this technology, you have recovered this technology, I sincerely hope that there have been breakthroughs in the black, but I'm led to the belief, as Eric Davis has inferred, that it hasn't happened yet. And maybe that's why there's a diffidence about telling the public about it, because you're losing a strategic advantage by being forced to talk about it. Or maybe, I mean, I'm fascinated by the work of Dr. Ning Li, a Chinese physicist who for a while was operating out of Huntsville in Alabama. She's kind of dropped off the radar. She seems to be now working with the Chinese government. But for a while, she was working with your Defense Department in Huntsville, Alabama, working on anti-gravitics research and talking about implied imminent advances in anti-gravitic propulsion technology that were just around the corner, a bit like America was talking about in the 50s and the 60s, and that it all also went black. If I was America and I knew that China was working in the black in super secrecy, rushing to try and develop this technology, well, the first thing I'd be trying to make sure of is that if the Chinese have this breakthrough, that we also have the right to use this intellectual property ourselves, hence the salvatory pay patents. You don't want to have to pay the Chinese the humiliation of paying one of your foreign rivals to use this technology would be too much. But I would also try and keep it secret as long as possible. And maybe this is the arrogance of us in the world of UAP research, that we think that governments ought to and should properly reveal this when they come to know about it. I'm asking the question, maybe there is a good reason why it's being kept secret. I like to think the best of these people, you know, but if it is being kept secret, why? Let's assume Admiral Tom Wilson, for example, was being lied to. If it is the case that the J2, the person briefing the Joint Chiefs of Staff and Intelligence Matters, is being lied to about a secret UFO re-engineering program, why the hell would you do that? You know, what's the reason why you would keep that secret? Why the obsessive secrecy? This is what I don't understand. But one of the things I am very, very sure of is that there is a cover-up. There are individuals that have gone around threatening people, trying to shut it down. There are lies that have been told to protect this. Something's going on. And I'm genuinely trying to understand it, and I'm puzzled. And the interesting thing is that if I was the person that's the gatekeeper of this secret, I would now be incredibly nervous. Let's talk for a moment, for example, about the Admiral Wilson document.
Yes, that's one thing I want to get to before we end in 20 minutes.
Yeah, sure. I mean, it may or may not be a real document, but I mean, I think there's a lot of questions that still need to be answered about that document. I know for a fact that it came from the estate of the late Edgar Mitchell, because I've spoken to the guy who literally has it sitting in his archive, and he got it directly from Edgar Mitchell's home with Mitch Harkins, Edgar's nephew, who saved the files from Edgar's filing cabinet. And that document, the Eric Davis memo, his notes of his alleged conversation with Admiral Tom Wilson at the Defense Intelligence Organization in 2002 in Las Vegas. Those alleged notes were in the archives of Dr. Edgar Mitchell that he'd been sent by Hal Puthoff from the National Institute of Discovery Science when Ed was on the Science Advisory Board of NIDS. And there's a huge body of archival evidence for the fact that there was a previous and ongoing relationship between Hal and Ed, where documents were shared from within NIDS to Ed Mitchell, some of which I'll be revealing and releasing in the next few months. They make really interesting reading. They show that Ed was being briefed by Hal Puthoff about discoveries that Bob Bigelow's NIDS was making. And it's fascinating. And one of the things that interests me is that Hal Puthoff clearly thought that this document was so significant that he should send it to an astronaut who quite openly talked about the fact that he thought the US government was concealing a secret about recovered extraterrestrial spacecraft. And Edgar told my source, the spaceman, the keeper of the archive, that as an astronaut, he was told it was treason to talk about what he knew and what he saw during the Apollo mission. But it was quite clear that Edgar was apprised of a whole world of US efforts to recover craft and to back engineer a craft. And he strongly believed that there was an extraterrestrial presence on planet Earth. And so let's come to that memo. If the memo's contents are true, and I emphasize Admiral Tom Wilson, retired of the DIA, says that they are not true, that the document is a fabrication, it never happened, he never had a meeting with Dr. Eric Davis in Las Vegas in 2002, he never met the guy. But if the document is true, it means that there is an aerospace company that in the black, behind multiple special access programs, is concealing recovered alien technology, which has been kept secret from most of the Congress and most of the military, and so much so that even the Joint Chiefs of Staff were not being briefed about it. I'm fascinated because, to me, it represents the most plausible way that you could keep something like this secret if that document is genuine. And the interesting thing about it to me is that the players, Eric Davis, Hal Puthoff, everybody involved in that document, with the exclusion of Admiral Tom Wilson, has conspicuously not denied its provenance. They've actually done nothing. They've done everything, if you like, to avoid confirming its contents, but they haven't said it's not a real document. And that's conspicuous to me. And I think there's also been acknowledgements by Hal Puthoff that Eric Davis did meet with Admiral Tom Wilson. So I don't know what to think, but the bottom line is, if that document is genuine, then it represents a perfect explanation for what's going on, that there are people in private aerospace who are the gatekeepers to this information. They've been hiding it probably since it was passed out of the DOE, when the DOE came subject to FOI laws in the 1970s. That's the Department of Energy. And if you think about it, the best place to hide this would have been inside the Department of Energy, which handles all of your nuclear weapons and nuclear power technology. So if you were trying to keep something super, super secret inside the American government, you'd actually keep it outside of even the military special access program protections. You'd keep it maybe under a Q clearance in the Department of Energy. And certainly you'd have to have one or two key military officials who were briefed into this, but maybe you'd keep them at the level of the senior review group of the Special Access Program Oversight Committee, orally brief them and have files that are completely separate from the mainframe. And oddly enough, that's what the Admiral Tom Wilson document describes. I mean, the level of knowledge that's required for somebody to have constructed a hoax document like that, and to have had the names that it's got within it, who were people who were operating at the time. It's a masterful hoax, if it's a hoax. And That's why I give credibility to the Admiral Wilson document, because I'm aware of its provenance. Nobody else is. I know that it was sent by Hal Puthoff to Edgar Mitchell, and that Edgar Mitchell regarded it as so important that he literally stuffed it in his archive files right next to other documents that he'd received from NEDS, and he attached great significance to it and made sure that it was protected and passed on after he died. And the interesting thing, though, in that document is there's no explanation as to why it's been kept secret. I mean, why? Let's assume the US has recovered alien technology, and let's assume that they haven't been able to replicate it. There comes a point, I think, where they're just going to have to admit it. What is the strategic national security advantage in not revealing it? Unless we're on the cusp of a breakthrough, unless we're on a cusp of finally achieving this technology and being able to show our rivals, our enemies, that they can't screw with us because we actually have a technology that is far beyond theirs. That's about the only plausible reason that I can see for maintaining the secret. If it's inconvenient to the US Air Force or people inside the US Air Force and certain elements of the intelligence services to reveal this, because it's kind of embarrassing to them, because it shows they've been dishonorable men by lying. This bullshit that comes through in the Tom DeLonge interviews, where Tom says that they said they were protecting the Republic by not revealing this secret. In what way was it protecting the public? I think that has to be explained. And I think one of the things that is going on at the moment is whoever it is that is controlling this secret is trying to constrain the narrative. I think they're hoping they can get away with not revealing recovered technology. And I think it's inconvenient to them for there to be a discussion about recovered technology. And I suspect that's part of the reason why things have gone a little bit cold, because they were thinking they could control the narrative by revealing the UAP task force is giving credibility to this anomalous phenomena and saying, wow, yes, we are going to investigate this, which essentially really is just a recap of what happened in the 1950s and the 1960s with Project Grudge and Project Blue Book. All it is promises from the US military that it's going to investigate aerial phenomena, and that it's a mystery, and that it's real, and that it's a potential national security concern. That is no different from what was happening 60, 70 years ago. And that's the way they want to keep it.
And just my personal, my personal opinion on the Wilson Davis document. I met Eric Davis a couple of years ago. I met Will Miller in 2000. Those are two of the three people mentioned in the document. Eric Davis has never told me anything. He said no comment. I interviewed Will Miller. Will Miller denied that the letter in there was his letter. He said it was a cut and paste job. But when I interviewed him, he did not want to comment about the letter, which is very telling to me. There's other things he could have said
And I know, Joe, as well, one of the things that Admiral Tom Wilson actually says in that memo, reportedly, is that if he's ever asked about this, he would lie about it, because any honourable officer, and I'm told Tom's a good man, he's an honourable, decent fella, any honourable person tasked with the deed of protecting this awesome national security secret has to lie about it.
No, I agree. And when I say, it's a program, he can't acknowledge it. And when I say he's lying, I never say it in some negative way. He has to do what he has to do. I've seen other things. Other people have shown me things that convince me beyond a reasonable doubt that it's a legitimate document. Whether or not what's in the document is real, well, then we talked to the other people that you've spoken to. I do think we have a craft. I don't think the document is a movie script. I don't think, as somebody suggested, Eric Davis was fooled by an imposter who only looked like Admiral Wilson. Some big name in our community, and I won't mention them here, has suggested that. So that's crazy to me. So I do believe that. But one thing that you wrote about, which I am amazed nobody has pointed out, Oak Shannon. Billy Cox interviewed Wilson a few years ago, and he goes, he interviewed Oak Shannon, and Oak Shannon, who was friends with Eric Davis and helped set up the meeting with Tom Wilson, he said, Oak Shannon said, I know both of those gentlemen, and if I've caused any embarrassment to Admiral Wilson, I apologize. That wasn't my intention. But when you spoke to Wilson, when you got a letter from Wilson, you could tell the story. You know, I was under the impression he knew Oak Shannon pretty well.
Tom Wilson basically denied knowing any of these people well at all. And he basically led me to the view that, he didn't have friendships with these people. It wasn't an issue. And it was quite clear from what Oak told Billy Cox, the wonderful Billy Cox, that that wasn't true, that he did know them really well, particularly Oak Shannon. And it was clear that the two of them did have a friendship or some kind of relationship, and Oak acknowledged that in his response to Billy. So, yeah, I mean, I don't like speaking ill of an American officer because I can't understand Admiral Tom Wilson's motives. But let's put the best possible spin on it. He's still bound by his national security oath. He inadvertently, because of his own inquiries, allegedly became aware of a secret program that was being kept secret even from the J2, the Joint Chiefs of Staff, the person who briefed the Joint Chiefs of Staff on intelligence matters. He, because of his perspicacity and his diligence, managed to discover this secret. And let's assume, for reasons of the good and the public interest, he decided to brief Eric Davis, whom he knew was a person who was operating under all manner of national security oaths and top secret security constraints. So he was well recommended by Oak and other people as a person of trust. And Eric made it clear in his exchange with him, and he honoured that he never intended for this information to become public, that it was for his own research. I mean, the way in which the memo became public was completely inadvertent because, I think when Hull sent it to Edgar Mitchell, it was clearly understood that it was to remain confidential. Edgar respected that confidentiality. But also Edgar did, in his lifetime, as Guliano Marinkovic has made note of, he actually mentioned on several occasions the fact that Edgar Mitchell did acknowledge his awareness of the meeting between a very senior Pentagon official and Eric Davis in his lifetime. So, yeah, I mean, I think there's a body of evidence there that at the very least is worthy of further investigation. And this is the difficulty. Imagine you're the keeper of that secret and you're now learning that Elizondo and Mellon are speaking publicly about recovered technology, recovered advanced technology, metamaterials that do astonishing things when they have a waveform current put through them. You'd freak, because it might mean that this cover-up of this recovered technology is now going to come up. You can't control this narrative. So you don't want military witnesses giving evidence at a congressional inquiry that you can't control. And that's what I suspect is happening. I suspect that behind the scenes, there are people who are determined to protect this national security imperative, who don't want it out. They still think it's inconvenient for this to be revealed. And I'm not making excuses for them, but I can understand why they might want to do that. I don't think it's sustainable. I think there's a momentum now. The genie's out of the bottle.
I agree. They're putting the pressure on.
History will judge. History will judge the people that tried to do the right thing. Let's assume for a moment that Tom Wilson, one of the original whistleblowers, that in his own way, inside the constraints of his national security oath, he felt comfortable telling somebody like Dr. Eric Davis what he thought was the reality that he'd discovered. He wanted an outside organisation that he viewed as responsible and scientific to be aware of what he knew about what the US government knew about this phenomenon. I think history would judge him as a patriot, as a decent man who, within the constraints of his national security oath, tried to do the right thing. But I think there are, and I'm aware of these people, I've spoken to some of them, I think there are people inside the program who similarly question the utility of keeping it secret. And this is one of the issues that's been explained to me. One scientist I spoke to explained to me that a large part of the reason why there hasn't been the kind of breakthrough in the propulsion technology that I think the US has been striving for over decades is because the secret is so heavily compartmentalized. It's so heavily constrained by security constraints that scientists can't do what scientists normally do, which is share information, exchange ideas, chew the fat about a problem. And I notice even Bob Lazar, if he's telling the truth, I'm not saying he is, but let's say, assume for a moment that he is telling the truth, he was acknowledging that there appeared to be frustration in the efforts that were being made at the mythical S4 to reassemble the technology or back engineer the technology that was represented by what he was asked to look at.
And that year that he came out is the same year that in the document, or no, the same year Eric Davis has said in interviews, that's when the program was last put away, 89, which is coincident, interesting.
Yeah. And isn't it interesting that probably 2 years after the exposés by George Knapp, all of a sudden, my sources in Australia start seeing weird triangular objects hovering over remote parts of American bases in northwestern Australia. Funny coincidence, huh?
Nice coincidence. And I know you only have 5 minutes left. What wasn't in the book? What was not in the book? What have you learned since then, since you published, that would just amaze people? Something really interesting. I would like to talk about slide 9, but we do not have time. Some other time.
Yeah, well, actually, one of the things that I have learned since I wrote the book is that our focus, investigating this, needs to be much, much more in the field of how whatever this is capable of manipulating human perception and consciousness. And I do think slide 9 is integral. I really do. Slide 9 being a PowerPoint briefing slide that was given to the Undersecretary of the Defence Department, which talked, as you say here, that the science exists for an enemy of the United States to manipulate both physical and cognitive environments in order to penetrate US facilities. It was a very clear statement to the Undersecretary for the Defence Department that whatever this technology is, it is capable of amazing things. And it was essentially a pitch by ATIP, the Advanced Aerospace Threat Identification Program, the people investigating the phenomenon for the Office of the Director of National Intelligence. It was their pitch to essentially get increased funding and to argue that this is and this was a national security issue because of what this phenomenon is capable of doing. And, for what it's worth, I have become more certain since I wrote the book that there is multiple intelligent technologies operating here. I suspect part of it might be experimental US technology, but I don't think it explains all of the phenomena. And I do think that there is quite probably some kind of intelligence that is not human, that is operating on our planet, that is doing weird shit. And I think slide 9 pretty much acknowledges that. And to me, the significance of slide 9 is that it was intended for a classified briefing for the Undersecretary of the Defence Department. This is what your defence planners were being told. And it's mind-blowing. And a large part of what I've learned since writing the book is that a large part of what people are seeing and engaging and experiencing with the phenomenon is something that is capable of manipulating what we see. And that's disturbing and more than a little frightening, because one, it shows that the United States and any military power on the planet is completely powerless against such a technology. And I can understand why any country wouldn't want to acknowledge that to its citizenry, because it might scare people. But two, it also raises the possibility that there is some kind of intelligence that isn't extraterrestrial, but there's something that we share our planet with. And that's something that I noticed Lou Elizondo, has hinted at quite strongly in the last few months. He's done a number of interviews where he's used the word intraterrestrial and interdimensional. So all I can promise you, Joe, is things are about to start getting very interesting, because I don't think the genie's going to go back into the bottle. I
No,
really think, I really do think we're destined for interesting times ahead.
I agree. I mean, as much as we were worried about this being a repeat of the 50s, I think I'm excited. You know, I'm still open-minded, and I'm looking forward to what happens. We'll see. Real quick, you're just open-minded about abductions and my labs.
I am, yeah. I mean, there's been a misconception that I'm dismissive of them. I'm not. I'm also interested in cattle mutilations. I don't know if it's linked to the UAP phenomenon, but I suspect that it is. I've had some awesome conversations since I did a TV story about cattle mutilations here in Australia, which was kind of like separate from the documentary I made. I think, funnily enough, the TV station that I made the show with were a bit embarrassed about putting cattle mutilations into the first story. But oddly, when we actually looked at the cattle mutilations issue, we became convinced that it is just the most incredible story. I've had multiple, I think 6 veterinarians have told me that they've seen anomalous excisions of organs that just cannot be explained. It's, as one of them said to me, it's like they used a laser scalpel that pulverized the wound at a microscopic level, where, for example, the entire rectum and anus of a cow, including parts of its lower intestine, were excised and removed without any discernible excisions on the exterior of the animal. And when you internally examined the animal, adjoining blood vessels that were microns thick right next to where this organ had been were still intact. And as he said to me, one vet, he said, look, I can't think of any technology that could do what that represents. It's mind-blowing. So cattle mutilations, as confronting and as disturbing as they are, I'm sure they're real, whatever they are. And they're just part of an accumulation of phenomena that require investigation. And I think the longer the media giggle and ridicule and stigmatize the subject, the less we're ever going to get a breakthrough in the area. And the one thing I take great heart from, Joe, frankly, is that shows like yours, forums like social media platforms like YouTube, Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, they are becoming more important than mainstream media. Mainstream media has lost its way on this issue. It's ridiculed and stigmatized the subject, and it's allowed itself to be manipulated. And the gatekeepers of this information, the people who are trying to keep it secret, they're in a complete panic because they can't do anything to stop people like you or me from investigating it. And there's a certain freedom there, because in the past, they could walk into the editor of a newspaper and say, listen, old chap, it'd be really nice if you stopped looking at that Westall UFO in Melbourne in 1966. Please stop publishing stories about that. It's really not good for national security. And the editor might go, well, yes, of course, absolutely. That era is over, because there's now a wisdom of the crowd. There are people out there, and I've been really heartened by the fact that every day. I mean, I turned on my phone this morning and I groaned because there was about another 300 or 400 messages. Every night I get messages from people offering me more information, including insiders, people who are corresponding with me. And you can find, by the way, my Proton Mail email, encrypted email on my Twitter handle. People are sending me information every day. I just can't keep up with it. But what it shows me is there is a hunger out there for the information. There is a desire for somebody to look at this issue. And I'm certainly not going to be able to do it all myself. And that's where people like yourself and numerous other people who are doing great work in social media and online, you guys matter much, much more than you realize. And I think, frankly, mainstream masthead media matters much less than it thinks. It's far less relevant. I mean, I've done interviews recently, which I know have been watched by many, many hundreds of thousands of people, and they've been predominantly online. And yet the major mass circulation newspapers in my country are lucky if they have a circulation of more than 100,000 paid subscribers per day. And that's pretty much the case everywhere in the world, including in America. The masthead media really only has the power and the clout that it has because we assume that it does. That era is over. The reality is that there is a delightful tyranny, a lovely anarchy that's coming with social media, which they can't control. And it's no coincidence that this transparency and accountability is beginning to happen now at a time when social media is assuming a relevance and a dominance, frankly, that it never had before. It's getting really interesting. And that's why, you're seeing pushes now for Facebook to be controlled. Congress and parliaments in different countries are trying to restrain what people can say and express on social media. And I think it's a very dangerous thing because it's the forum where a lot of these questions are now going to begin to be answered.
And you can answer this short. Ross, I promised a friend. Answer short. I know I didn't expect you to answer the last one so long, and I don't want to keep you. Your sources, anybody say we're dealing with interdimensional, and has they discussed whether or not it's one intelligence acting, portraying itself as many, or is it several intelligences, according to various sources you've spoken to?
I have not had sources that have been categorical with me about what the phenomenon is that provided this technology. They've talked about the technology and they've talked about how advanced it is. It represents nothing that is known within human science. I mean, for example, Nat Kovitz, the Director of Science and Technology Development for the US Navy, when he set himself up in private business, he specialized in a form of welding called electron beam welding, which was a very, very high quality, super strong form of welding, which doesn't leave the traditional bead that is normally left with a conventional welder. And he'd worked on, I think, the C4 Galaxy undercarriage, and he was well known and well acknowledged inside the US Air Force in particular as somebody who knew his stuff with high quality metal bonding. And for that reason, after he went into private enterprise, he was called by the US Air Force and asked to come to the Wright-Patterson Air Force Base, which you and I would know as the Foreign Technology Division. And under heavy security, he was shown what he described to me as a bulkhead. And he suspected that it was something alien. He suspected that what he was looking at was not of this world because, and his suspicion was confirmed when he looked at it both with his own eyes and up close with electron scanning microscope, because they were wanting to know whether it was possible that it had been bonded using electron beam welding technology. And he could see immediately that it wasn't. And when he looked at it at a molecular microscopic level, he said it was mind-blowing because whatever it was, it had been bonded at the atomic level. It was like layers of electrons had been bonded in a way that he just could not explain. And that is fascinating to me because that was an on-the-record source telling me that he'd seen something that he suspects was not of this world.
And with that, amazing piece of information. And I want to thank you for being here. I want to thank you for the past year and whatever it's been, answering my questions in our conversations, because you helped me a lot. And I hope your book is important. I hope a lot of mainstream people read it and it just gets them just looking into the evidence. That's all we need. Just take a serious look with an open mind, and we can go from there.
And vice versa, Joe. I don't think people like yourself realize the role and the impact that you had here. But as Lou Elizondo has emphasized, I think social media is the key.
It's great. All right, Ross, good luck with the rest of your interviews. I appreciate the time, and we'll talk soon.
All the best, mate. Cheers. Bye-bye.
Bye. And that is it. I was hoping some would call in, but nobody called in. I think people are shy, which is kind of disappointing, but I understand. And I was going to do an Ask Me Anything with Michael on Saturday, but he's having some health issues, so we can't do that. If you guys have any questions for me, I will stick around for a little bit more, and we gotta get people to call in. I love that. I love that we get people calling from anywhere in the world. But if you want to ask questions, I checked the chat. I didn't see any questions popping up for Ross, and I probably missed them because I was trying to focus on what he was saying. Thanks, Thomas. I saw you pop in, and it just kept saying you weren't connected. You're Give me 1 second. I just want to grab something. It said you weren't connected. It said your phone, your camera, and your audio were not connected, so I couldn't do anything. Yeah, Gregory, I read it. Took me like 4 days. I was cramming it. It's really good. There's a lot of details in there for people who are familiar with the subject that it's new information, and I'm glad I got to interview Ross. A little stressed going in, but it was okay. I'm glad we got to slide 9 too, because if slide 9 is real and they can manipulate it, I really don't know how you can believe any type of experience if they're manipulating your perceptions. But, you know, and Ross sees that and he's open to it. And I wanted to get a little more into my labs, but I know he had another interview. I'm going to eat dinner unless, do you think Ross will inspire more journalists to look at the subject? I hope so. I mean, from what he talks about, there are already people reaching out, and he has not, from what I heard him talk about the other night or yesterday, he has not received any feedback, negative feedback from any of his colleagues. There are people who have been surprised and said, what are you doing? But nobody's like made fun of him or, you know, tinfoil hat stuff. Louise, have you heard that cattle mutilations are a food source for the others? I have not heard that. You know, I think most of the cattle mutilations are carried out by humans. But there are some cases that do not fit that. I mean, Christopher O'Brien's book, the Stalking the Herd, it's a massive book. He's like, yeah, he thinks it's humans testing the food chain and the food source. A great book on that is, it's not mutilation material like you would think, but Colin Kelleher, who worked for NIDS, and I have his book. I have not read it all. I forget what it's called. Brain. It's something called Brain, but Colin Kelleher, and he thinks it's them testing, checking the food chain and the meat supply and related to mad cow disease. But there are some cases that, you know, defy explanation. Using their blood. I don't know. I mean, I've spoken about theories from the 90s. I heard that there are certain interdimensionals or whatever who feed off of our negative energy, and I got slammed for even bringing that up. I know DeLong has brought it up too, but a lot of people have spoken about that over the years. Back a long time ago, that subject came up. I don't know. I know it's controversial, so I don't really talk about it much. And I do think, you know, it's either I've spoken to people who have different theories, you know, sources, you know, multiple groups here, interdimensional, extraterrestrial, ultra-terrestrial. It's like, and then you talk to somebody who is right in the middle of things, and he's like, the evidence is contradictory. And I've tweeted this before. The last thing they said, after looking at all the evidence, it's a shit show, meaning it's just no way to figure it out. You think you have it figured out, and then another piece of evidence comes in. It's like, oh, that doesn't make sense for that theory. So yeah. And Dr. Eric Davis, I wish he could speak because he would be on so many shows. It's just his job. You know, they don't want him to talk about it ever since the New York Times article came out, which Brian Bender has spoken about. I'm not a big CE5 fan, Louise. I don't think anybody's had anything negative, but I mean, I have not, maybe there are some CE5 experiences that have been negative. I have not heard them, so I don't think it's, just based on that, I don't think it's a bad thing. It's just not my thing. Especially if they can, yeah, like you said, if they can manipulate perception, how can you trust anything? And when I was on the Richard Dolan Young Guns panel with Jay from Project Unity, he's like, yeah, how can you trust any of your experience? And Carla Turner said there was one one experiencer, abductee, who said she had this amazing experience. They brought her and she was in front of, what's up, Sean? They brought her in front of this crowd and she was speaking and she had such a great feeling. And then when she remembered being back in her car, she did not feel well and she went under hypnosis, and the hypnosis was something really negative. So if you believe the hypnosis, the original great memory was just a screen memory. So it's like, and Carla Turner was like, we can't trust anything. She goes, I don't know what we're dealing with, ET, interdimensional, but sometimes whoever they are, they lie. Some of them lie. And I love Carla Turner, and I don't know why I rejected her work earlier. There are other people. I'm going to go back and look at some of Linda Moulton Howe's work, because I've looked at that and said, when I read it at the time, her Glimpses of Other Realities Part 2, I was like, I liked it. But then over the years, I became more skeptical and more conservative. But I need to go take a look at that again. No, Jay has said, Jay may have had an experience, but he talked about how you cannot trust your experience as far as it being a literal representation of what you're seeing. Because Jay knows about slide 9. He's asked Lou about slide 9. He's asked Ross about slide 9. So it doesn't mean he's not. I mean, I think he's having an experience. And obviously, if I think telepathy is real, which I do, then if there are other beings here, we can communicate with them. So it's not like a big stretch for me to think you could try to bring in craft. And, people should watch the George Knapp recent interview where he interviewed 3 people who can summon UFOs. One of the videos is really good. I mean, it's probably one of the better home videos I've ever seen. You should take a look on Mystery Wire. It's not that long ago. Just fast forward to that video if you don't want to listen to them. But these regular guys doing CE5 type of stuff. Do you think more sources will come out and talk with investigators and journalists? Yeah, I mean, that's what's encouraging about Ross. And give me 1 second. I got to get a drink. That is what is encouraging about Ross. He wrote letters and he got responses. If you believe the people, Nat, if you believe those folks were involved in the program, then yeah. So more people are speaking up. I could see it. I can only see it getting better unless, I don't know how they can put a kibosh on that if these guys are coming out mostly anonymous. I have never asked Hal, Kit, or I don't think I've asked Eric about slide 9. Maybe I may have. I mean, I have messages from him that are. I have to put them in a document one day because there's so much. But I have not. Kit doesn't do interviews anymore. I really need to publish my Kit Green interview. It's a lot of good stuff in there. I'll add audio to it, which I'm kind of glad I waited because I can really add some context to that. He wanted to make sure that I tell everybody that the interview was done in December of 2019, and his opinions have changed since then, so just keep that in mind. But I also said, can you tell me what opinions have changed? He's like, I don't have time to go through the interview and tell you. So, but I am going to publish that. I mean, there's no reason why I won't. I just have to do it. And the other thing, and I shared it with somebody. It's the one remote viewer, it was Lynn Buchanan, who said he saw military guys working with ETs. And he's like, just matter of fact, he goes, it could have been a doll, it could have been a dummy. He goes, I don't think so. But he goes, I was in a place, I can't tell you what the work was because it was classified, but it was humans, and next to them looked like little grays, working with them. Totally crazy for a lot of people. It's even crazy for people to talk about crash retrievals, but that's what he said. And he said he knew other people other people in the military who had experienced it, and not during remote viewing. It was just doing his regular job. How great would it be if Neil McCaslin came out? I mean, or James Latkatsky, who ran OSAP. I mean, those people, Lou keeps wanting these folks. I'm not sure Lou's talking about McCaslin, but I'm sure Lou would be so thrilled if Latkatsky came out. Oak Shannon, a scientist who was friends with Dr. Eric Davis. He was part of the John Alexander Advanced Theoretical Physics group. Grant Cameron pasted some of his notes recently on Facebook. It may not have been recently. I saw it recently. And he is the one that convinced Tom Wilson to meet with Eric Davis in 2002. And like I said to Ross, the meeting happened, the notes are real. I have zero doubt. I've seen things which I can't talk about, but even the stuff publicly, I mean, for me, if you look at it, it's no doubt that they met. And Oak Shannon helped set that meeting up. And Oak Shannon said if he, he introduced those two, and if he caused any embarrassment, and he apologized. Tom Wilson is a good man. And meanwhile, then he tells Ross, I don't know who Oak Shannon is. So it's like, is Tom Wilson throwing us a bone by saying that? Because it's obvious, Oak Shannon, very religious person. He's not just going to lie about knowing Tom Wilson. It makes zero sense to anybody who looks at that. So, hey, Joe, if the president can't discuss UFOs, what do you think has more authority than him? I don't know if it's about authority. I just think he doesn't have access. And that's one thing. I'm very liberal. I wasn't a Trump fan, but the one thing I wanted Trump to do to say, what do you mean I don't have access? I'm the president. Get me into that building. Let me know where it is, and just bulldoze the door down, go in and take the craft. But that obviously didn't happen. The coincidence between George Knapp and the triangles showing up. I'm not really sure you know what I mean. You mean, I think he meant 89 was when the program supposedly went into hibernation, and then that's when some triangles started showing up in Australia, where Ross suspects maybe they started testing their advanced craft out there. I think that's what he was just speculating about. What's the most important questions for you personally would like to have answered by folks like Lou? The one thing, Jeff, is do you have any hard evidence, proof that any of these groups or intelligences are using us, and is there any way to stop it? And are there groups out there that are willing to help if we reach a critical mass and we reach out? I think, the whole Prime Directive, I do think that there's something to that. And if we get to enough people on this planet who ask for help, I think they would step in. But without that, they're not going to step in. They may shut off nukes and turn on nukes. I think that's about it. I mean, and then you have, I don't know if it's one group or multiple groups. So it's confusing. That's another thing. If they have evidence 100% that it's multiple groups. I mean, James Fox is working on a documentary about Varginha. So that's a case in the mid 90s in, I think it's Brazil, Varginha. And certainly seems like they're weird looking ETs. If that's the case, then there's multiple groups here right away, right? And then you got the whole ultra terrestrials. But I would like to know if they had hard evidence that any of these groups are causing us harm. Because if they're not, we don't have to worry about it, Get us the information out. Then it's only technology they're worried about keeping secret. Hessdalen, I went to Norway, Hutch. I wanted to visit Hessdalen. I did not get to see it. It's really interesting. I don't know if it has anything to do with ET or non-human, but it's consistent and it's repeatable. I mean, there's a video on YouTube where J. Allen Hynek went to Hessdalen. You should check that out. So there's definitely a phenomenon there. I don't know what it is. Let me see what else. Christopher Dunn. Valet's metamaterials are out. No, but I don't know if you saw on YouTube, on Twitter the other day, Dr. Gary Nolan was speaking about how his colleagues are really a lot more open-minded on this subject. And I don't know if he means UFOs or the metamaterials they're being tested. But that paper is not that far away, I believe. It'd be great if it was this year. Sometime this year would be awesome. 19 Westall. I have a Westall picture. Westall, and of course I wanted to get into more. But here's a cool Westall picture, which I did not get to, which I found today. It was a drawing from one of the witnesses, and it's kind of cool because it matches what John Lennon saw in '74 in New York. He wrote that song, Nobody Told Me that Days Like These. I don't know what the name of that song is, but he said, there's UFOs over New York and I ain't too surprised. So that craft seems like it matches what was seen in Westall. It's really close as far as the top, but pretty neat. Westall is amazing. And it's another thing I wanted to get into. We ran out of time. Westall, there was the teacher who was intimidated into shutting up, and they told him, if you talk about this anymore, we can tell people you were drunk that day. and you'll lose your job. Other people have been intimidated. And Lou Elizondo talked about a close colleague of his saying that he ran into a group that would grab UFO data before anybody else could get to us, and they would intimidate people. It's like, who are those people? And he's like, I think Lou said they were like a Men in Black type extra governmental group. Don't quote me on that, but he did mention a Men in Black type of situation. Lou had never encountered them, but he believed his colleague had. I'm trying not to put that up. Just seeing. This is very hard to scroll through chats. Here we go. And I did speak with somebody. If you look at my mega blog, I spoke to somebody who's mentioned in the Wilson Davis documents, and the person asked me not to use their name. The person gave me way too many details. If I would have used every detail that person gave me, you would have been able to figure it out right away. So I took some of those out. But guy didn't really want to talk to me at first, but he did. He wound up talking. He told me him and his wife loved the movie Paul, and my friends are like, maybe that's a covert way of telling you about what the ETs look like. Watch Paul. And I did watch Paul, and it was good, but I don't know if he was really trying to say anything with that. When I first called him, I said, can I speak to so-and-so? I almost said his name just now. And he said, his wife answered, it's some guy from Las Vegas, a reporter who wants to talk to you. I'm like, there's no way he's getting on the phone, but he did. I said, can you tell me about the Admiral Wilson and Davis documents? No. But then we talked about UFOs, and it's in my mega blog. That's some interesting thing to say. He did not want this information to be made public, did not want UFOs to be confirmed, very conservative, thought it would wreck religions, ruin the planet, that type of stuff. President can talk about that. I don't think, one of the things, I don't think these people, I don't think Christopher Mellon even knew about the crash retrieval program until he was briefed or educated by some folks and other people. Harry Reid, I don't think he was briefed into the program. I think he was around people, and Bigelow and Eric Davis, all those people. They shared, and I'm sure they have information that they have not shared with us. Hope, Bigelow has alluded to pictures. Maybe they have pictures, I don't know. Elizondo, Stephen Greer, and people like, I know people shun Greer and they recoil when I mention his name, but he said that, Danny Sheehan told him that Lou Elizondo had been in a government facility and he saw a craft, and Lou has denied that, but I've heard otherwise privately. So that's one thing I didn't get to ask Ross about, Lou's role. Is it as much as people suspect he had oversight on everything, I'll have to ask him that. Maybe some other time. Yeah, the whole area, Storm Area 51 didn't go over very well. Just trying to see if there's any more questions. 5 more minutes. Do you know if Greer Mitchell Miller showed Wilson the alleged NRO document with the codenames list, and Wilson recognized some of the codenames, and given Corso book made him take Greer? I think those codenames were sent ahead of the meeting, RGH, and then Wilson did. I don't know if Wilson did his sleuthing before the meeting or after. And there was also a letter in '95. From Will Miller to Wilson trying to set up the meeting, speaking about Greer and Mitchell. And whatever was on that document helped Admiral Wilson locate the program. There's no doubt, I have no doubt that happened. And I do believe that we have a craft, but I don't have as much conviction on that as I do that the documents are real and Davis met with Wilson. Yeah, Lou said somber, but if people knew what Lou knew, if people asked Lou, if people knew what you knew, what would they think? And Lou said somber. But that, that could mean, you could take that so many different ways. I mean, for some people, the fact that we're not alone and there's an intelligence that's, highly advanced intelligence on this planet, that alone, if we're not the top of the food chain, that alone could make people somber. So, and then people think, uh-oh, it's bad news. Lou knows about the ones who are eating us and making us disappear like the missing 911 stuff. David Paulides, he knows all that bad stuff, and people are going to be very somber. So, I mean, I don't know. I don't know. And I don't think he would go into detail anyway if he could. I mean, if he did know. And I think Lou does know a lot. Hopefully he just starts letting it out if he gets some clarification from the IG investigation on what he can speak about and not have the folks in the Pentagon threaten his security clearance like they've been doing. Leak to Greer. Yeah, that's one thing Ross brings up in the book. Why did Greer outed Wilson? Greer outed Patrick Hughes, who Greer and Miller briefed a few months later. And that's another thing. If Greer, Wilson admits that Greer and Miller and Mitchell, they had a meeting, but Wilson denies looking into the information they provided him. So Wilson admitted that the meeting took place. If that meeting was not great and wasn't impressive to Wilson, his boss wouldn't have had a meeting with Miller and Wilson a few months later in '98. It's like, so obviously whatever Miller and Greer and Mitchell told Wilson was enough for Wilson to say to his boss, hey, you should take this briefing too. And that happened last year. You would think if it was garbage, Wilson would have said, don't bother, And as far as, who else did Greer out? Yeah, Greer outed, he ran, talks about Lou after Sheehan runs to him. Sheehan said, this is what Lou said. I don't know why, if Sheehan did that, not a great thing. I don't know why you would tell Greer, but why is there a current lull? When there's a lull, that usually means Lou and Mellon are doing stuff behind the scenes. So let's see what happens. I don't think Wilson was read in. I do not. Yes, to serve. That's the Twilight Zone movie. To serve man, Thomas. Yeah, Lou has explained the somber stuff. You can read so much into that. I believe it was Ross that said Lou had the very top oversight. Yes, and yes, I wanted to touch on that again because in Ross's book he talks about how Mellon and the Gang of Eight and Harry Reid was part of the Gang of Eight, and they would have oversight on all of those special access programs. But I don't think they had access. They didn't even know it existed. It's kind of hard to have oversight if you don't know something exists. Everyone hates him, but if the UFO thing blows open, Greer will get a lot of credit. I give him credit now. I mean, I'm not one to just totally pile on, and when I see that, I'll usually take the other side. If there is another side, I won't just say it for the hell of it. Greer's done a lot of good stuff. I mean, I do think he met with the CIA director, Woolsey, and whether or not it was a briefing, I know Woolsey had a problem with that, but you do not invite Stephen Greer to a dinner that was set up by John Peterson of the Arlington Institute and not expect to talk UFOs. Why would you invite him there? Why? So he can talk about his emergency room procedures? Yeah, Lou versus McCaslin. I don't know. I know so little about McCaslin. I would think that's a good question. Good question to ask Lou. McCaslin is such a mystery. I mean, it would be nice. I think the only reason we know he was involved is the WikiLeaks stuff. I need to go over again. There's really great stuff in WikiLeaks that I did not even get to talk about with Ross, but it's in the book. It's great stuff. I mean, talking about how the information is there. We just know you need to know where to look, and it gets really specific. He talks about the one thing. I forget the guy's name, Bob French, and he talks about how certain UFOs coming out of the water, they put out a certain frequency, and so our government knows that, and when they see that frequency, they just don't bother. He goes, but if I were to give you that frequency, then our adversaries would create a craft with that frequency, knowing that we're not going to go after it. So he wouldn't give that information up. But it's really good stuff in the WikiLeaks. And yeah, Hillary Clinton was they were planning on doing stuff with Hillary. Would have been interesting to see if she had won, but she didn't. So let me see if I'm going to, anything else? How you doing, New York Tag? McCaslin now a member of Space Force. I don't know. Bob Fish, that was it. Thank you, Drew. Bob Fish. That part of the book, I didn't know that. I mean, I need to go over WikiLeaks again. It's another weak point of mine, besides history. And Ross's book touches enough on history where I took a lot of notes that I can refer back to as far as educating myself on some of the history. My question is, who at these legacy corps knows? Who at Lockheed? I don't know how many people. You would think the majority of Lockheed, if there's a craft at Lockheed or Northrop, you would think that majority do not know. I would think. I don't know if even Steve Justice would be read into something like that. Jeff, Luis was asked in an interview, has he ever met McCaslin, but he gave a no comment. There you go. I would love to transcribe all of Lou's interviews. There's just so many. I can do all of Eric Davis's interviews, but Lou, there's too many. I got to pick and choose. I wonder why Luis is able to talk about the 23-minute video, but he's not allowed to describe the objects in the video. Yeah, I agree. Tell us what's in the video. Tell us what... I think he's just being careful. I think he wants some clarification. I think Lou legally can discuss. I haven't put any comments up, but that one's going up. That has ruined the stream, Mr. Silva. Nicole, did you get a chance to ask Eric Davis if he holds patents or has pending? I have not, because he's on vacation right now and he's not responding to my messages. But I will, because he hasn't looked at my last ones. When he's on vacation, he does the smart thing. He avoids social media, which is a good thing to do, which I have to learn. Although I don't take vacations right now, so. Is Tom leaking information in his films? Yeah, that's what he said. He said he's going to try to get information out. But the whole problem with DeLong is I believe everything DeLong says as far as these people told him stuff. But did they lie to him is the question, Kit Green and Mirage Men says that they put out this information to make us think there's some scary story. But when the real story comes out, we'll say, oh, that's the real story. Oh, I thought it was something scary. The real story isn't that scary. And they call it the, I think Kit called it the... what the heck is it called? I don't know, but it's the core story, multiple extraterrestrial groups. We have some with their craft. They left. That's it. Don't know if that's true. Can the stream be viewed later? Yeah, I think when I cut it off, it just goes to YouTube, Dutch Blue Eyes. So yeah, go to sleep and you can watch it later. I should have just got rid of all my history questions and just stuck with crash retrievals, and I would have gotten to more stuff. Live and learn, next year. I mean, I'm not going to bother Ross for another interview for a while. Could Lou be nitpicking with his answer about not seeing a craft? He could be, or he's just worried about losing his pension and his clearance, and there's just absolutely no reason to risk that right now. I think Lou will share more and more as he's done over the years. I mean, the very beginning, he wouldn't even talk about the other videos. Now he's talking about a 23-minute video, so hopefully Danny Sheen could get more clarification on the IG investigation and what he can and cannot say. What's your opinion of LA's latest book? I have it. I haven't read it. Yeah, and I also have the Witnesses book, too. Forget his name, and it's overdue from the library from New Mexico, and I have to pay a big fine if I don't return it. I think it's like $100, which I probably can read quicker. Definitely quicker than Ross's book. Ross's book took me a while because I'm a slow reader as I get older. I'm not trying to put up questions. I'm trying to scroll through. Yeah, I don't know. What is the specific nature of the security clearance in terms of what he can and can't say? I don't know. That's the question. It's like, where does he draw the line, Lou Elizondo, what he can and can't say? It's a good question for him. Yeah, and Chad, Lou says, I should put these things up. Lou says, what do I make of Lou saying he believes? It's important that he says, I believe. He didn't say, I know. There's a difference. Like when Dr. Eric Davis talks about meeting people in these other programs and they share information up to a point on what their programs are doing. I mean, that's how he learned about the crash retrieval program. If you read the transcript and listen to his interviews, did Lou get the information the same way? Did Lou speak to other people in other programs? If that's the case, it's hearsay. Of course, if those are people he knows and trusts, then he can say, yeah, I believe them, but I don't know for sure. I don't know if he's seen a craft. Would not surprise me. Thanks, Louise. I'm going to take off too, guys. I'm going to eat dinner. Have I reached the DeLong ever? No, but I thought about it, especially now since it's a really down time. Reach out to TTSA. It's a really good idea. So, all right, guys, I'm going to take off. Thank you for being here. It was like 100 throughout the night, which is great. Hopefully you heard something new from Ross. If not, interesting information. I think he's an important part of getting this information out. I'm lucky I met him through James Rigney. The other thing is, if you read the book, thanks, Jeff, thanks, Haida. And if you read the book, he talks about things that Dr. Edgar Mitchell said specifically to one person called the spaceman. So, and Mitchell had never said it publicly before, and I don't want to ruin it for you, but obviously related to UFOs and the moon. It's really cool. That's another thing that should be a blockbuster when I heard about that. Between that and Oak Shannon, the Wilson, which I think is another lie, saying he doesn't know Oak Shannon. He obviously knows Oak Shannon. And I don't know if it's just a way of Wilson throwing us a bone. But like I said, I have no bad feelings towards Tom Wilson saying what he has to say. And Corso, how does Corso fit into the story? I mean, I'll get to that in a second. Corso, by the way, I bought Corso's book signed last year because I thought the whole thing was going to break open and my book would be worth more money, but it didn't happen. Corso fits in. I'm drawing a blank right now. I'll just tell you that I know Eric Davis believes Corso. Corso was given the responsibility of taking some material from Roswell and feeding it out to other corporations so they could reverse engineer it. And some of the stuff in the book is not accurate as far as what was made from that reverse engineering, but his notes are supposedly very accurate. His diary or his journal, and that's online. The book is a lot of added stuff. Bill Burns gets a lot of the flack for that. And so if you could find his, and I've tweeted it out before, but it's Corso's journal, which is more concise, and it has a short part on Roswell, which a lot of people, like Eric Davis, has spoken about Corso, and they believe him. There's some people that don't believe him. Like John Alexander doesn't believe that he believes Roswell was a mogul balloon. So Eric Davis does not. And the only thing I've heard about 60 Minutes is Danny Sheehan said there are 2 more scheduled interviews with Lou. If that happens, let's see what they do. 60 Minutes had such a great effect. Thanks, Tim. I think that's Tim who I went to college with. All right. I'm going to end it. Thanks, everybody. Yeah, we lost the momentum, New York NYT tag, but just hang in there. There's going to be ups and downs. It's going to be like that. People wanted disclosure, and I get carried away sometimes too, but it's going to take a long time. Hopefully I'll be alive. I don't know if Nicole's still here, but she's like, we're doing this for our kids, for the next generation. I hope that's not the case. I hope I get to see something major. I mean, what we're seeing now is something I've never seen before, since I've been in this in '96. It's the crooked Bengal. Yeah, Tim, I went to school with this guy. He was the mascot. Oh, wrong picture. But it's still, there's Nicole. Yeah, I went to school with this guy. I graduated in 1987. I don't think I talked about UFOs with Tim. He was the mascot, the school mascot, the Bengal. But yeah, Nicole, are you crying or laughing? Because if it's our generation that's going to get the breakthrough, I'm just going to give up now. Nah, I have fun, so I'll keep doing this. If I didn't have fun, I would not do this. I'm not, I don't have expectations that we're going to get the truth, whatever the truth is, in the next couple of years. But just as long as we keep making progress, and Lou and Mellon and the people behind them keep making progress with the members of Congress. I don't think we're enough. I do not think there's enough of us to make a difference. And, you know, it's funny. Mellon, in one of his interviews, I think it was with Martin Willis in 2016, he said, I was in, you know, congressional aides, whatever he was doing, and he saw the letters that came to Congress and the representative he was working for, and he said they went into the garbage. If there's enough of us, though, it would make a difference. I just don't think we have enough people yet. I think we need Congress to give Congress time to digest the info. With regular people, I just think they're working their jobs and they can't worry about this right now. They need something to blow them away. They need the 23-minute video. If that somehow gets out, that really could push us to the next level. What that next level is, what third gear is, I don't know what third gear is. See, NY Tag, you said thanks. I don't even remember what I just answered from you. Because my mind is crumbling from the past 2 days of just cramming Ross's book and taking notes. Yeah, if Lou ever ran for Congress, he talks about, they don't want me in Congress. They don't want a dude like me in Congress. That would be great, but I'd rather have him doing what he's doing now. But if he ran for Congress and won, that would be amazing. Imagine his interviews. He would get massive coverage. And there's still stigma now. But I am going to go eat. Thanks, everybody, for hanging in there for questions. I wish, I guess I should have done comment questions for Ross. I thought people would call in, but I guess people don't like that. So I'll remember that next time. I was just hoping it would be easier just to go in order of taking calls. So anyway, all right. Have a good night, guys. Thanks again.